The rain came down in sheets over Red Creek, Montana, pounding against window panes and swelling the creek that gave the town its name. Lightning tore across the blackened sky, illuminating the empty streets for brief ghostly moments before surrendering them back to darkness. Most of the town's residents had the good sense to stay indoors on such a night. Most, but not all. Elijah Morgan pulled his sodden coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he made his way down the muddy main street. At 58, the former Union soldier felt each step in his bones, each year of hard living etched into the weathered lines of his face. He hadn't meant to stay in town so late, but the supplies he needed couldn't wait another week, and neither could the whiskey that now warmed his insides against the chill. Another flash of lightning illuminated the row of buildings ahead. Elijah paused, narrowing his eyes. There in the second-floor window of Hammond's bank, a light flickered where none should be. It was well past midnight, and Walter Hammond, for all his faults, wasn't known to burn the midnight oil. A sensible man would have kept walking. Elijah had spent 20 years perfecting the art of minding his own business. 20 years of solitude on his small patch of land outside town. 20 years of avoiding entanglements of any kind. But something instinct, perhaps, or the ghost of the soldier he once was, made him stop and watch. The light moved across the window, then suddenly disappeared. In the next flash of lightning, Elijah saw a shadow fall across the glass, a figure stumbling backward. Then, nothing. "Damn it all," he muttered, turning toward the bank. The weight of his revolver pressed reassuringly against his side as he approached the building's entrance. The door was unlocked. Another bad sign. Elijah pushed it open slowly, wincing at the creak of hinges. Inside the banking hall lay in darkness, but a thin strip of light spilled down the staircase from the office above. He drew his gun and moved silently across the polished floor, years of military training, returning with each careful step. At the top of the stairs, he paused, listening. Nothing but the drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. Elijah took a deep breath and pushed the office door open. The scene before him struck like a physical blow. Walter Hammond lay sprawled on his back behind his desk, eyes fixed on the ceiling in the vacant stare of death. Blood pooled around him, soaking into the expensive carpet. His white shirt was stained crimson across the chest. "Christ!" Elijah breathed, stepping cautiously into the room none still raised. The office had been ransacked. Papers littered the floor drawers, pulled open books scattered. The painting that normally hung behind Hammond's desk had been removed, revealing the wall safe behind it. The safe door stood open, its contents emptied save for a single item, an old leather-bound Bible. Something about that Bible sitting alone in the cleared safe raised the hairs on Elijah's neck. It seemed deliberately left behind like a message. He holstered his gun and reached for it. As he lifted the Bible from the safe, a folded piece of paper fell from its pages. Elijah picked it up and unfolded it carefully. Written in a neat hand were the words, "The truth will set you free," John 8:32, followed by a single name, Victoria. The name meant nothing to Elijah, but the staged quality of the scene, the empty safe, the carefully placed Bible spoke of something more complex than a simple robbery gone wrong. He opened the Bible, finding the inside cover inscribed with the name George Hammond in faded ink. Elijah's heart tightened. George Hammond, Walter's father, a name he hadn't allowed himself to think about in nearly 2 decades. The floorboard creaked behind him. Elijah spun around, but too late. The deafening crack of a gunshot filled the room. White-hot pain seared through his left shoulder, spinning him backward. He caught a glimpse of a dark figure in the doorway before falling against Hammond's desk, knocking a lamp to the floor. The shooter fled, footsteps pounding down the stairs. Clutching his bleeding shoulder, Elijah pushed himself upright. He should give chase, but the room spun around him, the pain making it hard to focus. Blood seeped between his fingers, warm and sticky. Below, he heard the bank's front door slam open. In moments, there would be witnesses' questions. The sheriff would come. For a man who'd spent 20 years avoiding attention, being found over a dead body would mean the end of everything. Acting on instinct, Elijah grabbed the Bible with his good hand and staggered toward the window that faced the alley. He pushed it open against the driving rain and climbed awkwardly onto the ledge. The drop was only 10 feet, but it felt like 100 as he let himself fall, landing hard on his side in the mud. Pain radiated from his shoulder, but Elijah forced himself to his feet, tucking the Bible inside his coat. He stumbled down the alley as shouts rose behind him, losing himself in the storm-darkened streets of Red Creek. By the time the sheriff arrived at the bank, Elijah Morgan was nothing but footprints in the mud, already being washed away by the relentless rain. 3 days passed in a haze of fever and pain. Elijah's cabin stood a good 5 miles outside town, a simple one-room structure of rough-hewn logs that he'd built with his own hands years ago. It wasn't much, but it was far enough from prying eyes to be safe. Or so he'd thought. He lay on his narrow bed, drifting in and out of consciousness. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, a small mercy that had saved him the trouble of digging it out himself. Still, the wound was angry and hot. The pain, a constant companion that spiked with each attempt to move. In his fevered state, Elijah's mind slipped between past and present, like a man wading through different streams. One moment he was in his cabin, the next, back on the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg, the air thick with gunpowder and screams. He saw George Hammond's face, younger, then determined, as he pulled Elijah down behind a stone wall, bullets whizzing overhead. He heard Rebecca's soft voice reading by candlelight, felt the phantom touch of her hand on his brow. "You're burning up, Eli," she whispered, though she had been gone these 7 years. The rain continued unabated outside, drumming on the roof in a ceaseless rhythm. Elijah had managed to clean and bandage his wound with supplies from his meager medical kit, but infection had set in nonetheless. He'd seen enough wounds in the war to know the signs. Without proper care, things would get worse before they got better, if they got better at all. On the table beside his bed lay the Bible from Hammond's safe, its leather cover worn smooth with age. In his more lucid moments, Elijah had examined it, finding a series of small numbers penciled in the margins of various pages. Some kind of code, perhaps, but his fever-addled mind couldn't make sense of it. The soft knock at his door came during one of these clearer moments, startling Elijah from his thoughts. Nobody came to his cabin. Nobody even knew where it was exactly. He'd made sure of that. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Elijah reached for the Winchester rifle he kept beside his bed, grimacing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. Slowly, painfully, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and pushed himself upright, steadying himself against the wall as the room tilted around him. "Who's there?" he called, his voice rough from disuse. No answer came, only another knock, urgent now. Rifle clutched awkwardly in his good hand, Elijah made his way to the door. He wasn't in any shape for a fight, but he'd be damned if he'd die hiding in his bed. He threw the bolt and pulled the door open, bringing the rifle up in the same motion, a movement that would have been smooth if not for the weakness in his limbs. The woman on his doorstep flinched back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She was young, mid-20s perhaps, with rain-dampened honey-brown hair and eyes the color of the storm clouds above. Her dress, once fine, was mud-splattered and torn at the hem, and a purpling bruise marked her left cheekbone. But it wasn't her bedraggled appearance that made Elijah's breath catch. It was the unmistakable resemblance to Walter Hammond in the set of her jaw and the arch of her brows. "Catherine Hammond," she said, confirming his suspicion. "Walter Hammond's daughter." Elijah kept the rifle raised. "What do you want?" Her gaze flicked to his shoulder where blood had seeped through his bandage and stained his shirt. "I know you have my father's Bible. I need it." A chill that had nothing to do with his fever ran down Elijah's spine. "I don't know what you're talking about." Catherine's eyes hardened. She pushed past him into the cabin, seemingly unconcerned by the rifle. Inside, she surveyed the sparse interior before turning back to face him. "There's a trail of blood from the bank to your land," she said flatly. "I followed it here. You were there the night my father was murdered." Elijah closed the door against the rain, leaning heavily against it. The brief confrontation had drained what little strength he had. "You followed blood for 5 miles in the rain. Not all the way, but enough to know which direction to go." Her gaze traveled to the dried bloodstains on the floor, where Elijah had dripped while tending his wound. The rest was educated guessing. "My father mentioned you once or twice, the hermit soldier who wants nothing to do with town." She was observant Elijah would give her that, but her presence posed a serious problem. If you followed the trail, others can too. "No one else is looking." She glanced around the cabin again, her gaze settling on the Bible on the bedside table. "They all think it was a robbery gone wrong. Simple, clean. But I know better." Elijah's finger tightened on the trigger. "Why are you here, Miss Hammond?" Catherine reached into her pocket, and Elijah tensed. But instead of a weapon, she withdrew a small Derringer pistol and placed it deliberately on the table. "I'm not here to hurt you, Mr. Morgan. I'm here because whoever killed my father is after that Bible, and they shot you too." Her voice cracked slightly. "I need to know what's in it. I need to know why my father died." Elijah studied her face, looking for deception. He found only grief and determination and something else, fear. Not of him, but of something that had followed her to his doorstep. "What makes you think I didn't kill your father myself?" Catherine's laugh held no humor. "If you had, you wouldn't have been shot with the same caliber bullet that killed him." She nodded toward his shoulder. "The killer shoots .38 caliber. I saw enough of my father's wound to recognize it." Smart woman. Too smart for her own good, perhaps. A wave of dizziness washed over Elijah, and he leaned more heavily against the door. Catherine noticed her expression softening slightly. "You're in no shape to throw me out, Mr. Morgan, and I'm not leaving without answers." She gestured to his wound. "Let me help you with that, and then we'll talk about the Bible." Elijah weighed his options, which were admittedly few. He could barely stand, let alone force her to leave. And if what she said was true, if the killer was still out there, still searching, perhaps having an ally wasn't the worst idea. Besides, there was something about Catherine Hammond that reminded him of Rebecca. The same stubborn set to her jaw, the same unwillingness to be dismissed. "Fine," he conceded, lowering the rifle. "But make no mistake, Miss Hammond, I didn't kill your father. I found him already dead, and I took the Bible because it seemed important." Catherine nodded, retrieving her Derringer and slipping it back into her pocket. "We'll start with that then. And Mr. Morgan, call me Catherine. I think we're past formalities when we're both being hunted by the same killer." Catherine Hammond moved with the efficiency of someone used to tending wounds. She helped Elijah back to his bed, then set about gathering clean water, whiskey, and fresh bandages. Her manner was clinical, almost detached, but Elijah noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she unwrapped his blood-stained bandages. "This is infected," she said, examining the angry red flesh around the bullet wound. "You're lucky it went straight through, but you still need proper care." Elijah watched her warily. "You have experience with gunshot wounds." A shadow crossed her face. More than I should. Red Creek has its share of violence, and my father—" She trailed off, focusing on cleaning the wound. Let's just say Walter Hammond didn't always handle business disputes peacefully. The cabin fell silent save for the persistent drumming of rain on the roof and Elijah's occasional sharp intake of breath as Catherine cleaned his wound. Outside, the storm showed no sign of abating, turning the world beyond the windows into a gray blur. "Why were you at the bank that night?" Catherine asked finally, applying a poultice of herbs she'd found among Elijah's meager medical supplies. "Wrong place, wrong time," Elijah said grimly. "I was heading home from town and saw a light in the window. The door was unlocked." Catherine's hands stilled. "And you just walked in, a man who by all accounts wants nothing to do with the affairs of others." Elijah met her gaze steadily. "I fought in the war, Miss Hammond. Some instincts don't fade with time." "Catherine," she corrected automatically, "and that doesn't explain why you took the Bible instead of reporting what you found." Elijah winced as she began wrapping a fresh bandage around his shoulder. "You ever been accused of something you didn't do? Catherine, it's not a pleasant experience. A man like me, with no connections and no alibi, found standing over your father's body. The sheriff would have had me hanging from the nearest tree by sunrise." Catherine tied off the bandage with practiced hands. "Sheriff Thornton isn't known for his thorough investigations," she agreed. "But that still doesn't explain the Bible. Why take it?" Elijah hesitated. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself why he'd grabbed the Bible. Instinct, perhaps, or something more, a connection to a past he'd spent years trying to forget. "It was the only thing left in the safe," he said finally. "Everything else had been taken. It seemed deliberate, like it was meant to be found." Catherine's gaze shifted to the Bible on the bedside table. "May I?" Elijah nodded, and she picked it up carefully, as if it might crumble in her hands. She opened it, examining the inscription on the inside cover. "George Hammond," she read aloud. "My grandfather." She looked up, a question in her eyes. "Did you know him?" Another piece of his past, unearthed like a long-buried bone. "We served together. During the war." "You never mentioned that to my father." "Your father and I weren't on speaking terms." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Yet, you recognized his Bible." Elijah didn't respond, and after a moment Catherine turned her attention back to the Bible, flipping through its pages. She paused when she came to a folded piece of paper, opening it carefully. "The truth will set you free," she read. John 8:32, and a name Victoria. She looked up sharply. "Who is Victoria?" "I have no idea," Elijah said truthfully. "The note was in the Bible when I found it." Catherine's fingers traced over the name, her brow furrowed. "Victoria," she repeated softly, as if testing the sound of it. "My father never mentioned anyone by that name." She continued examining the Bible, pausing occasionally to study the small numbers penciled in the margins of certain pages. "These look like some kind of code," she murmured. Elijah nodded. "That was my thought, too. Though what they mean, I couldn't say." Catherine closed the Bible with a sigh of frustration. "My father was many things, but a cryptographer wasn't one of them. These numbers must reference something specific." Elijah watched her face carefully. There was genuine confusion there, and grief, too, kept tightly in check. If she was putting on an act, she was doing a damned good job of it. "You believe I didn't kill your father," he observed. Catherine set the Bible aside. "I believe you were shot by the same person who killed him. Whether that makes you innocent or just another target, I haven't decided." A fair assessment, more than he'd expected. "Why come here alone?" he asked. "If you suspect your father was murdered, Why not go to the sheriff? Catherine's laugh was bitter. Sheriff Thornton is firmly in Judge Montgomery's pocket, and the judge— She trailed off, her expression darkening. Let's just say I have my suspicions about who might benefit from my father's death. Elijah raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. Catherine stood and moved to the window, peering out at the rain-soaked landscape. My father changed in the weeks before his death. He became remorseful, started talking about making amends, about sins coming back to haunt him. She turned back to face Elijah. The night before he died, he told me to be careful who I trusted, that there were powerful men in Red Creek with secrets worth killing for. And you think the Bible holds those secrets? I think it's our only lead. Her gaze hardened. So you can understand why I'm not leaving without it. Elijah considered his options. The fever was making it hard to think clearly, but one thing was certain: he was in no condition to stop her from taking the Bible if she wanted it. And yet, she hadn't simply grabbed it and run. She'd stayed, tended his wounds, shared what she knew. You could have taken it while I was unconscious, he pointed out. Catherine's expression softened slightly. I could have, but then I'd have no one to help me understand what's in it. She glanced at his wounded shoulder. Besides, it seems we have a common enemy. I thought perhaps we could help each other, an alliance. It had been a long time since Elijah had allowed himself to trust anyone, let alone the daughter of a man he'd deliberately avoided for 2 decades. And yet, there was something compelling about Catherine Hammond, a resilience he recognized, a determination he respected. If I agree to help you, he said carefully, I need your word that once we find what we're looking for, you'll let this end. No dragging me into town affairs, no involving me in whatever vengeance you're planning. Catherine held his gaze steadily. If what I suspect is true, Mr. Morgan, this goes far beyond personal vengeance. But yes, you have my word. Help me find out who killed my father, and I'll leave you to your solitude. Elijah nodded once, decision made. Then I suggest you get comfortable, Miss Hammond. This storm isn't letting up any time soon, and neither of us is in any condition to go hunting for killers just yet. Catherine glanced down at her mud-soaked dress and rain-dampened hair. I suppose you're right. She hesitated. I should warn you, if I found you, others might too. All the more reason to rest while we can, Elijah said grimly. Tomorrow will bring troubles of its own. Night fell early, hastened by the unrelenting storm clouds that hung low over Red Creek. Inside the cabin, Catherine had built up the fire to chase away the damp chill that seemed to seep through the walls. Elijah, his fever slightly reduced thanks to Catherine's care, sat propped up in his bed, watching as she moved about the small space with growing familiarity. She had found a change of clothes, an old shirt of his, and a pair of trousers that she'd cinched at the waist with a length of rope. Her own dress hung by the fire, steaming gently as it dried. The casual practicality of the gesture spoke of a woman unbound by the typical constraints of her station. Your father must have had interesting ideas about how to raise a daughter, Elijah observed as Catherine returned from gathering more firewood from the lean-to outside. She paused, arms full of split logs. What makes you say that? Most bankers' daughters I've met wouldn't know how to dress a wound or be comfortable wearing men's clothing. A small smile played at the corner of Catherine's mouth as she added wood to the fire. My father was unconventional in some ways. He believed in education for women, in teaching practical skills alongside proper manners. The smile faded. My mother died when I was 15. After that, I became something of his assistant. I learned about banking, about business, about the less savory aspects of both. Elijah nodded unsurprised. Walter Hammond had a reputation as a shrewd businessman, not always scrupulous in his dealings. "And did you approve of your father's methods?" Catherine straightened, brushing wood chips from her borrowed clothes. "I loved my father, Mr. Morgan. That doesn't mean I was blind to his faults." She met Elijah's gaze directly. "He wasn't always a good man, but in the end, I think he was trying to be. That's why I need to know who killed him." Elijah understood that sentiment more than he cared to admit. Redemption was a powerful motivator and often came too late. "Tell me about the days before his death," he said. "You mentioned he changed." Catherine settled into the chair beside the fire, her features cast in flickering amber light. "It started about a month ago. He began reviewing old accounts, old transactions, spent hours in the bank vault. When I asked what he was looking for, he said he was setting things right." She stared into the flames, her voice growing distant. "Then he started giving things away. Returned a parcel of land to the Miller family that he'd foreclosed on years ago. Made donations to the church. Wrote letters he wouldn't let me see." She looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. It was as if he knew his time was running short. "Did he mention any threats, anyone specific he was afraid of?" Catherine shook her head. "Not directly, but he did mention Judge Montgomery several times. They'd been associates for years, but suddenly Father couldn't stand to be in the same room with him." She hesitated. "The night before he died, he was drinking something he rarely did. He said something about the sins of our fathers. When I asked what he meant, he told me that sometimes a man has to face his past before he can rest." Elijah's gaze drifted to the Bible on the table between them. "And you think this has something to do with it?" "I think it's not a coincidence that the only thing left in his safe was a Bible with a note about truth and a woman named Victoria." Catherine leaned forward. "Mr. Morgan, did you ever hear my father or grandfather mention that name?" Elijah considered the question carefully. His interactions with Walter Hammond had been deliberately minimal over the years, limited to the occasional unavoidable encounter in town. "As for George Hammond, your grandfather and I weren't close," he said finally. "We served together, that's all. Different men thrown together by war." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all Elijah was willing to share for now. Some memories were best left undisturbed, like sleeping vipers that could still strike after decades of dormancy. Catherine seemed to sense his reticence. "You said the Bible belonged to my grandfather." Elijah nodded. "His name is written inside. Strange that my father would keep it in his safe then. He wasn't a religious man." "Sometimes objects hold value beyond their obvious purpose," Elijah said, "especially those connected to the dead." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. After a while, Catherine's eyes began to droop, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up with her. "You should rest," Elijah said. "Take the bed. I'll keep watch." Catherine shook her head. "You're wounded. You need proper rest more than I do. I've slept in worse places than a chair by the fire." "So have I," she countered, but her protests weakened as another wave of fatigue washed over her. Finally she relented, moving to the narrow bed. "Wake me in a few hours. We'll take turns." Elijah nodded, though he had no intention of waking her. Despite the fever and the pain, he felt more alert than he had in days. There was something about having a purpose again, about being needed, even if only temporarily, that sharpened his senses. Catherine was asleep almost as soon as her head touched the pillow, her breathing deepening into the steady rhythm of exhaustion. Elijah watched her for a moment, struck again by her resemblance to her father, and more distantly, to George Hammond. The same proud bearing, the same stubborn set to the jaw. Hammond blood through and through. When he was certain she was truly asleep, Elijah reached beneath his chair and pulled out a small wooden box he kept hidden under a loose floorboard. Inside, wrapped in a faded piece of cloth, lay a tarnished cavalry badge, the metal worn smooth in places from years of handling. He unwrapped it carefully, turning it over in his palm. The weight of it was familiar, comforting in a way few things were anymore. It was one of the few possessions he'd kept from his former life, a tangible link to the man he'd once been. The badge had belonged to George Hammond, a gift given in a moment of vulnerability that neither man had ever spoken of again. Elijah closed his eyes, allowing himself to remember. Gettysburg, 1863. The air thick with gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. The Confederate charge had broken against the Union line, but at terrible cost. Elijah, then a young lieutenant, had taken a bayonet to the leg while leading a counterattack. George Hammond, a captain in the same regiment, had dragged him behind a stone wall as bullets whizzed overhead. "Stay with me, Morgan," Hammond had urged, tearing strips from his own shirt to bind Elijah's wound. "That's an order." Elijah had laughed, the sound harsh with pain. "You know I outrank you in stubbornness, Captain." Hammond's smile had been grim as he worked. "That you do, Lieutenant. That you do." They'd spent hours behind that wall, pinned down by enemy fire, as the battle raged around them. In those hours, with death so close, they could feel its breath on their necks. They'd talked as men only do when they believe they might not see another dawn. About their homes, their families, their fears. Hammond had spoken of his young son Walter, not yet 10 years old, of his hopes that the boy would never know war as they had known it. He'd shown Elijah a small Bible he kept in his breast pocket, its cover stained with the blood of previous battles. "My father gave this to me," he'd said, flipping through its worn pages. "Said it would keep me safe. Hasn't failed yet." When the Union forces finally broke through and reached their position, both men were half delirious with blood loss and exhaustion. Before the medics separated them, Hammond had pressed the Bible into Elijah's hands. "Keep it," he'd insisted. "Bring it back to me when this is all over. A promise between friends that we'll both make it home." Elijah had protested, but Hammond had been adamant. "Consider it a loan, Morgan, one you'll repay in person." And Elijah had carried that Bible through the rest of the war, through battles and marches and the long, lonely nights between. And when the fighting was finally over, he'd sought out George Hammond, intending to return it as promised. But by then, everything had changed. Elijah opened his eyes, the memory fading like mist in sunlight. He'd never returned the Bible. Instead, he'd kept the badge a private reminder of a debt that could never be repaid. And now, 20 years later, George Hammond's Bible had found its way back into his hands, carried by the daughter of the boy George had spoken of with such hope and pride. The coincidence felt too neat, too deliberate, as if some unseen hand had orchestrated their meeting. Elijah glanced at Catherine's sleeping form, a new weight settling in his chest. He'd told her the truth earlier, he hadn't killed Walter Hammond. But he hadn't told her everything. Some secrets were better left buried for everyone's sake. He rewrapped the badge and returned it to its box, sliding it back beneath the floorboard. Then he settled deeper into his chair rifle across his lap and prepared for a long night of watching. Outside, the storm continued unabated, isolating the small cabin in a world of wind and rain and memories too painful to face in the light of day. Morning arrived without fanfare, the transition from night barely noticeable through the rain-streaked windows. The storm had weakened to a steady drizzle, but dark clouds still hung low over the land and promising more to come. Elijah, who had dozed fitfully in his chair, despite his intentions to keep watch, woke to find Catherine already up and moving about the cabin. She had rekindled the fire and was heating water in the small iron kettle he kept for coffee. Her hair, now dry, was tied back with a piece of twine, and she'd rolled up the sleeves of his borrowed shirt to keep them from swallowing her hands. There was something oddly domestic about the scene, a glimpse of what life might have been like if Elijah had chosen a different path all those years ago. "You should have woken me," he said, his voice rough with sleep. Catherine glanced over her shoulder. "You needed the rest. How's your shoulder?" Elijah flexed it experimentally, wincing at the stab of pain. "Better than yesterday. The fever's down at least." She poured hot water into 2 chipped mugs, adding a measure of coffee grounds to each. "Not gone, but down. Another day of rest, and you might actually be fit for something besides scowling." Despite himself, Elijah felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. Catherine Hammond had spirit, he'd give her that. "I don't recall inviting you to stay another day," he said, accepting the mug she offered. Catherine settled into the chair opposite him, her own mug cradled between her palms. "You didn't invite me to stay last night either, yet here we are." Her expression grew serious. "Besides, we have work to do." She nodded toward the table where the Bible lay open. "I've been looking at those numbers. I think they might be references to specific verses." Elijah took a sip of his coffee, appreciating its bitter warmth. "Bible verses. That seems straightforward enough." "Not quite. The numbers don't match any chapter and verse combination I've tried." Catherine leaned forward, pointing to a sequence penciled in the margin of one page. "Take this one, 14 to 7:19. The Bible only has 66 books, so it can't be referring to the 14th book, 7th chapter, 19th verse." Elijah frowned. "Maybe they're not verses at all. Could be dates or—" "Wait." Catherine's eyes widened. "What if they're not referring to the Bible itself? What if they're a different kind of reference?" She flipped quickly through the pages, scanning each marked number. "Here, 12, 5, 14, 7, 19, 23, 4, 17, 42, 8, 2. Her voice trailed off as she counted silently. "There are 26 different number sequences, exactly 26. Elijah saw where she was going. "The alphabet. Each number could represent a letter." Catherine nodded excitedly. "If the first number is the page, the second is the line on that page, and the third is the specific word." Together, they began to decode the message, working through each sequence methodically. It was slow work, complicated by the age of the Bible and the faded pencil marks, but gradually, a message began to emerge. Victoria Winfield, murdered. 1865. Buried behind old church proof in strongbox, Hugh knows. Victoria Winfield, Catherine breathed, her face pale. Murdered and buried behind the old church. Elijah studied the last part of the message. "H.W., those are your father's initials." "Walter Hammond knows." Catherine translated, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father knew about this murder." She stood abruptly, pacing the small confines of the cabin. Victoria Winfield. Why does that name sound familiar? She stopped suddenly, her gaze distant with realization. Wait, there was a photograph in Father's study, an old one from before I was born. It had 3 people in it: my father as a young man, Judge Montgomery, and a woman. She turned to Elijah. I think her name was Victoria. Elijah felt a chill that had nothing to do with his fever. When was this photograph taken? I'm not sure. The 1860s, I think, after the war. Catherine's brow furrowed. But if Victoria Winfield was murdered in 1865 and my father knew about it, It doesn't mean he was involved, Elijah cautioned, though the doubt in his voice was clear. Catherine's laugh held no humor. Mr. Morgan, in my experience, when people know about murders and keep quiet, it's rarely because they're innocent bystanders. She ran a hand through her hair, dislodging strands from her makeshift tie. My father was hiding this Bible in his safe, a Bible with a coded message about a murdered woman, a Bible that someone was willing to kill for. She sank back into her chair, the weight of realization settling over her. What was he involved in? Elijah wished he had an answer for her, but the truth was, he knew very little about Walter Hammond, beyond the man's public reputation. The banker had been successful, respected in town, despite, or perhaps, because of his sometimes ruthless business practices. He'd served briefly on the town council, was known to be close with Judge Montgomery and other prominent citizens. Nothing in his public life suggested involvement in a decades-old murder. But Elijah knew better than most that public faces often masked private sins. The message mentions proof in a strong box, he noted. Any idea what that might refer to? Catherine shook her head. My father had several strong boxes and safes. It could be any of them or none at all. Elijah took another sip of his now cooling coffee, thinking. The Bible belonged to your grandfather. Is it possible these notes were his, not your father's, George Hammond? Catherine considered the possibility. I never knew him. He died before I was born. But if these are his notes, she trailed off, her gaze returning to the Bible. That would mean he knew about this murder too. A silence fell between them, heavy with implication. If both George and Walter Hammond had known about Victoria Winfield's murder, had kept the secret for decades, what did that say about the Hammond family? And more immediately, what did it mean for Catherine? There's something else in the Bible, Elijah said, finally reaching for it. Something I noticed last night. He turned to the back cover where the binding had started to come loose. Carefully, he slipped his finger into the gap, feeling around, until he found what he was looking for. A small, folded piece of paper tucked into the lining. Hidden compartment, he explained, easing the paper out. Old soldier's trick. Your grandfather wasn't the first owner of this Bible. He unfolded the paper carefully. It was a photograph, yellowed with age, but still clear. 3 people stood in front of a white church building, dressed in the formal style of the post-war era. A young Walter Hammond, barely out of his teens. Judge Clifford Montgomery, then in his 30s, his beard not yet streaked with gray. And between them, a woman in her early 20s, fair-haired and serious-faced, her hand resting on a stack of books. Elijah turned the photograph over. Written on the back, in faded ink, were the words, "Justice for Victoria, Judgment Day will come." Catherine took the photograph with trembling hands. That's her, Victoria Winfield. She studied the image, her brow furrowed. The church in the background, that's the old church mentioned in the message. It burned down years ago. All that's left is the foundation. Elijah watched her face carefully. The message said she's buried behind it. Catherine's gaze snapped up to meet his, and that there was proof in a strong box. Her voice strengthened with determination. We need to go there, to the old church site. Elijah shook his head. Not when you. I've done my part, Catherine. I gave you the Bible, helped decode the message. What you do with that information is your business. You can't be serious. Catherine set the photograph down. Mr. Morgan, someone killed my father and shot you over this. You're already involved, whether you like it or not. All the more reason to stay clear of whatever happens next. Catherine's eyes flashed with anger. So you're a coward, then, happy to hide out here while I face this alone? The accusation stung more than Elijah cared to admit. Being cautious isn't the same as being a coward, Miss Hammond. It's about knowing when a fight isn't yours apart. And this fight found you the moment you walked into that bank, she countered. Besides, you're the one who taught me about duty and obligation. Elijah raised an eyebrow. I don't recall giving any lectures on the subject. Not to me. Catherine picked up the photograph again, tapping Victoria Winfield's image. But I imagine you said something similar to my grandfather when you served with him, about not abandoning your comrades. A low blow, but not inaccurate. Elijah had indeed believed in such things once in duty, in honor in standing by those who stood by you. But that was a lifetime ago, before Rebecca's death, before the long years of solitude had hardened something inside him, before he'd learned that sometimes the cost of involvement was too high. Your grandfather and I served together, he said carefully. That doesn't make us friends, and it certainly doesn't obligate me to help you dig up a 20-year-old murder. Catherine's expression softened, some of the fire leaving her eyes. No, it doesn't, she agreed. But this isn't just about a 20-year-old murder anymore. It's about my father's murder. It's about whoever shot you. It's about the truth, Mr. Morgan. Don't you want to know why you were dragged into this? Elijah did want to know more than he cared to admit. The question had gnawed at him these past 3 days. Why had Walter Hammond kept George's Bible all these years? Why encode a message about a murdered woman? And most pressingly, why had someone decided now, after 2 decades, that the Bible was worth killing for? But more than answers, Elijah wanted peace. The quiet life he'd built for himself, far from the complications of town and the ghosts of his past. Getting involved with Catherine Hammond's investigation threatened all of that. And yet, looking at her determined face, so reminiscent of George Hammond in his better moments, Elijah felt the stirrings of something long dormant. A sense of responsibility, perhaps. Or simply the acknowledgement that some debts could never truly be forgotten, no matter how many years passed. One day, he said finally, I'll give you 1 day of my help. We'll go to the old church site, look for this strong box. After that, we part ways. You continue your investigation in town where you belong, and I return here where I belong. Agreed. Catherine's smile was small but genuine. Agreed. She extended her hand, as formal as if they were concluding a business transaction. 1 day. Elijah took her hand, noting the strength in her grip despite her delicate appearance. 1 day, he repeated. And Catherine, if we find nothing at the church, that's the end of it. Some secrets are buried too deep to unearth. Her smile faded, replaced by a solemnity that aged her beyond her years. In my experience, Mr. Morgan, no secret stays buried forever, no matter how deep you dig the grave. Truer words had rarely been spoken, Elijah thought grimly. And some graves once opened revealed horrors that changed everything. The day passed slowly, the rain continuing its relentless patter against the roof and windows. Catherine spent much of it examining the Bible further, searching for additional clues, while Elijah rested, allowing his body to fight off the lingering infection in his shoulder. By evening, his fever had broken completely, and though the wound remained tender, the angry redness had begun to recede. They agreed to wait until morning to visit the old church site, partly due to Elijah's condition, and partly because the continued rain made any excursion impractical. Instead, they prepared for the journey as best they could. Catherine cleaned and loaded her derringer, while Elijah sharpened his hunting knife and checked his rifle. As night fell, they shared a simple meal of salted venison and hard bread, the only provisions Elijah had on hand. The cabin grew dark except for the warm glow of the fireplace casting long shadows on the rough-hewn walls. "Tell me about her," Catherine said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Elijah glanced up from the fire. "About who? The woman you lost?" Catherine's gaze was direct but gentle. There's a grave out back with a simple marker. Rebecca. And you have a woman's silver hairbrush on your shelf, though you've clearly lived alone for years. Observant as always. Elijah should have expected no less. Rebecca was my wife, he said after a long pause. She died 7 years ago. Fever took her while I was away. Catherine's expression softened with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry. Was it sudden? No, and yes. Elijah stared into the flames, the familiar ache of loss rising in his chest. She'd been ill before, off and on. Nothing serious, or so we thought. I went to Helena on business, expecting to be gone a week at most. By the time I returned, she was already buried. The memory still had the power to gut him, coming home to find a neighbor waiting with the news, the fresh mound of earth behind the cabin where Rebecca had asked to be buried, the silence of a house that would never again hear her voice. That's why you live out here alone, Catherine said softly. You're punishing yourself for not being there. Elijah's gaze snapped to hers, sharp with sudden anger. You don't know anything about it. Don't I? There was no challenge in Catherine's voice, only understanding. My mother died when I was 15. Consumption. My father was in Denver on business. By the time he returned, she was gone. She looked down at her hands folded in her lap. He never forgave himself. Started working longer hours, rarely came home. When he did, he could barely look at me. The parallel wasn't lost on Elijah. Because you reminded him of her, Catherine nodded. I have her eyes, her laugh. Every time he saw me, he saw what he'd lost and what he'd missed. She met Elijah's gaze again. So yes, Mr. Morgan, I do know something about it. The anger drained from Elijah as quickly as it had come, leaving only the hollow ache that had been his constant companion these 7 years. My apologies. Catherine accepted the apology with a slight nod. Did you love her very much? More than I knew how to say, Elijah admitted. She was light, joy, everything I wasn't. How did you meet? The question brought a ghost of a smile to Elijah's lips. I was building a house in Helena just after the war. Rebecca was the daughter of the local doctor. She brought food to the workers one day, apple pie that she'd made herself. Terrible pie. Crust like leather. His smile grew more genuine at the memory. But she had this smile that made you not care about the pie. Catherine smiled too, encouraging him to continue. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, Elijah went on, surprising himself with his willingness to share. Too tall, too thin hair that never stayed properly pinned. But her eyes, they saw everything, missed nothing. She could look at a person and know exactly what they needed sometimes before they knew themselves. She sounds remarkable. She was. Elijah's smile faded. Too good for the likes of me, that's certain. But she chose me anyway. Said I needed someone to remind me the world wasn't all battlefields and bloodshed. Catherine leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Is that why you came here after she died? To prove her wrong. The question struck closer to home than Elijah was comfortable with. I came here because there was nothing left for me in Helena. Nothing but memories, Catherine said softly. Sometimes memories are the worst ghosts of all. They fell silent again, each lost in private reflection. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm, a natural counterpoint to the crackling of the fire. My father changed after my mother died, Catherine said eventually. Became harder, more focused on business. The bank became everything to him. She traced a pattern on the arm of her chair with one finger. But these last few weeks he was different again. Almost like the father I remembered from childhood. More human. Elijah watched her face in the firelight. You think it had something to do with this Victoria Winfield business? I'm certain of it. Catherine met his gaze. The timing is too perfect. He finds evidence of a murder from 20 years ago, starts making amends, then ends up dead himself. It can't be coincidence. Few things in life are, Elijah agreed. Catherine's expression grew distant. He used to say that. There are no coincidences, Catherine, only consequences we haven't recognized yet. And it was one of his favorite sayings. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. Along with our choices make us who we are. Wise words. Yes, I just wonder what choices he made that led to this end. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture both vulnerable and defiant. I loved him, Mr. Morgan. Despite everything, his ambition, his sometimes questionable business practices, the distance he kept after Mother died, I loved him. But I'm starting to think I didn't know him at all. Elijah understood that feeling all too well. The discovery that someone you thought you knew completely had depths you never suspected, secrets they never shared, burdens they never revealed. It was a particular kind of betrayal, all the more painful because it came posthumously when there was no chance for explanations or forgiveness. People are complex, Catherine, he said gently. They can be many things at once, good and bad, honest and deceptive, brave and cowardly. Your father may have done things you wouldn't approve of, may have kept secrets he wasn't proud of. That doesn't erase the man you knew. Doesn't it? Catherine's voice was small. If everything I believed about him was based on a lie, what's left? The truth, Elijah said simply, however painful it might be. Catherine nodded slowly, her expression resolving into determination. Yes, the truth. She straightened in her chair. Tomorrow we find out what happened to Victoria Winfield. And perhaps then I'll understand what happened to my father as well. Elijah hoped for her sake that the answers they found would bring her peace rather than more pain. But experience had taught him that old secrets once unearthed rarely comforted those who dug them up. Some ghosts were better left undisturbed. But looking at Catherine Hammond's resolute face in the firelight, Elijah knew they were past the point of caution. The wheel was in motion, had been since the moment he stepped into Walter Hammond's office and found the banker dead. All they could do now was follow where it led and hope the journey didn't destroy them both in the process. Outside, a rumble of distant thunder suggested the storm wasn't finished with Red Creek yet. An apt metaphor, Elijah thought grimly, for what awaited them tomorrow. The rain had finally stopped by dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean, the colors more vibrant under a pale blue sky. Elijah and Catherine set out early, following a seldom-used trail that wound through the dense forest separating Elijah's cabin from the outskirts of Red Creek. They moved cautiously alert for any sign that they were being followed or watched. Catherine had changed back into her own dress, now dry, but still showing the effects of her journey through the storm. Elijah wore his usual attire, sturdy work pants, flannel shirt, and a well-worn leather vest. His Winchester rifle was slung across his back, and Catherine's derringer remained tucked in her pocket. The Bible, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, was secured inside Elijah's saddlebag. They spoke little as they traveled, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Elijah's shoulder ached dully with each step, but it was a manageable pain, one he could push aside through long practice. More concerning was the growing certainty that they were walking into something larger and more dangerous than either of them fully understood. The old church site lay on the far side of Red Creek, about a mile past the current town limits. Once it had been the center of the original settlement, but as the town grew and moved closer to the railroad, the church had been abandoned in favor of a newer, larger building in town. The old structure had eventually burned down in a fire some 15 years ago, leaving only its stone foundation and a small, overgrown cemetery. It was nearly midday when they reached the site, approaching from the back to avoid being seen from the road. The foundation stones of the church were still visible, though partly reclaimed by moss and ivy. Behind them stretched the cemetery, its weathered headstones leaning at odd angles, the names long since eroded by time and elements. The message said Victoria Winfield was buried behind the church, Catherine said quietly, surveying the scene. But I don't see any marker with that name. If she was murdered, they wouldn't have given her a proper burial, Elijah pointed out, scanning the area beyond the cemetery's boundaries. Look for disturbed ground, unusual formations. They split up, Catherine, searching through the cemetery, while Elijah examined the land beyond its low stone wall. The ground was soft from the recent rains, making it difficult to distinguish between natural depressions and potential grave sites. After nearly an hour of searching, they reconvened, both empty-handed. "Nothing," Catherine said, frustration evident in her voice. "No marker, no sign of a grave, nothing." Elijah frowned, surveying the landscape again. The message also mentioned a strongbox with proof. "Any ideas where that might be?" Catherine shook her head. "If it was in the church, it would have been destroyed in the fire." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of disappointment settling over them. Then Elijah noticed a small cottage a short distance away, almost hidden among the trees. Smoke rose from its chimney, suggesting it was occupied. "Someone lives there," he observed. "Might be worth asking if they know anything about the church's history." Catherine followed his gaze. "It's worth a try." They approached the cottage cautiously. It was a simple structure, well maintained despite its age, with flower boxes in the windows and a small vegetable garden to one side. An elderly woman was hanging laundry on a line stretched between two trees, her movements slow but purposeful. She turned at their approach, squinting against the midday sun. "Can I help you folks?" Catherine stepped forward, offering a polite smile. "Good day, ma'am. We're researching the history of the old church and wondered if you might have some information about it." The woman studied them thoughtfully, her gaze lingering on Elijah's bandaged shoulder, visible beneath his partly unbuttoned shirt. "Research, is it? Academic sort of thing?" "Family history," Catherine clarified smoothly. "My grandfather was associated with the church, and I'm trying to learn more about his time here." The woman nodded slowly. "Well, I've lived here since before the church burned down. Name's Martha Taylor. I served as midwife to half the town in my younger days." She gestured toward her cottage. "Come in for some tea, and I'll tell you what I know." Elijah exchanged a glance with Catherine. They'd hoped for information, but this was more than they'd expected. Catherine nodded slightly, and they followed Martha into her home. The interior of the cottage was as neat and well-kept as the exterior, filled with the accumulated treasures of a long life. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, and a collection of hand-sewn quilts draped over every available surface. The air smelled of lavender and wood smoke. "Sit, sit," Martha urged, gesturing to a small table near the hearth. "I'll put the kettle on." As she busied herself with the tea preparations, Elijah took the opportunity to study their hostess more closely. Martha Taylor was in her 70s, at least her white hair pulled back in a simple bun, her face deeply lined, but her eyes sharp and alert. There was a wariness about her that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by their story. "So," she said, returning with the tea, "which family are you researching, dear?" Catherine hesitated only briefly. "Hammond. My grandfather was George Hammond." Martha's hand trembled slightly as she poured the tea, the only sign that the name meant something to her. Hammond, you say that would make you Walter's daughter, then? Catherine, isn't it? Catherine's surprise was evident. Yes, you knew my father. Everyone in Red Creek knew your father, child. Martha's tone was neutral, giving nothing away. And I've known the Hammond family since before you were born. She settled into a chair across from them, her gaze now fixed on Elijah. And you, sir, you're not from around here. Just helping Miss Hammond with her research, Elijah said. Martha's smile didn't reach her eyes. How neighborly of you. She turned her attention back to Catherine. Now, what exactly did you want to know about the old church? Catherine glanced at Elijah before responding. Actually, we're looking for information about someone who might have been associated with the church around 1865. A woman named Victoria Winfield. The effect of the name was immediate. All color drained from Martha's face, and her hands began to tremble so badly that she had to set down her teacup. Where did you hear that name? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering, Catherine reached into her pocket and withdrew the photograph they'd found in the Bible. Do you recognize this woman? Martha took the photograph with shaking hands. For a long moment she stared at it in silence, her expression a complex mixture of grief, fear, and what might have been guilt. Victoria, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I knew her. She came to Red Creek in the spring of '65, just after the war ended. A school teacher from back east full of ideas about education and progress. She looked up, her eyes suddenly sharp. Where did you get this picture? It was among my father's possessions, Catherine said carefully. Martha, do you know what happened to Victoria Winfield? The old woman's gaze moved between Catherine and Elijah, as if assessing how much to reveal. Then, with a deep sigh, she seemed to come to a decision. They killed her, she said flatly. Those three men in that photograph, your father, Judge Montgomery, and Francis Hathaway, Lawrence Montgomery's father. They killed her and buried her body behind the church. Despite having suspected as much from the coded message hearing it stated so plainly was like a physical blow. Catherine's face paled, but she maintained her composure. Why? She asked softly. Why would they kill her? Martha set the photograph down, her hands still trembling. Victoria discovered something they didn't want known. Something about money war funds that were supposed to go to rebuilding but disappeared instead. She shook her head. But that wasn't the only reason. She rose slowly and moved to an old chest in the corner of the room. From it she withdrew a small worn journal bound in faded blue cloth. Victoria kept a diary. She gave it to me the day before she died. Said she feared for her safety. Martha's voice broke. I should have done more to help her, but I was young and afraid. By the time I found my courage, it was too late. She returned to the table and handed the journal to Catherine. She wrote everything in there about the missing funds, about the threats about her fear. Martha's gaze fixed on Catherine's face with sudden intensity. And about the child. Catherine's head snapped up. Child? What child? Victoria was with child when they killed her, Martha said softly, nearly 6 months along. Your father and the others didn't know, or if they did, they didn't care. Elijah felt a chill run down his spine. The murder of a pregnant woman added a new dimension of horror to an already grim tale. The baby died with her, Catherine asked, her voice barely audible. Martha shook her head slowly. No, that's why they called me that night. Victoria wasn't quite dead when they buried her, just unconscious. She went into labor from the trauma. They dug her up when they heard her screaming. Catherine made a small, pained sound, and Elijah found himself reaching for her hand beneath the table, offering what little comfort he could. They called me because I was the midwife. Martha continued, her eyes distant with memory. Told me a drifter had attacked her, that they'd found her too late. I knew they were lying. There was no drifter, and Victoria's injuries weren't those of an attack. But they were the most powerful men in town, and I was a widow with children to feed. She took a shuddering breath. I delivered the baby, a little girl. Victoria lived just long enough to see her, to name her Mary. Then she was gone. And the child? Elijah asked, speaking for the first time since Martha had begun her tale. I took her to a family in the next town over, the Edwards family. They'd lost their own baby a month before and were desperate for another. They raised her as their own, never knowing where she came from. Martha's gaze returned to Catherine, searching her face. Mary Edwards grew up, married a man named Robert Hammond, your mother, child. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Catherine sat perfectly still, her face drained of all color, her hand gripping Elijah's with surprising strength. My mother, she repeated numbly. My mother was Victoria Winfield's daughter. Martha nodded. Which makes Victoria your grandmother. That's why you looked so familiar when I first saw you. You have her eyes, her way of holding yourself. Catherine released Elijah's hand, rising unsteadily to her feet. She moved to the small window, staring out at the old church foundation without really seeing it. My father, she said finally. Did he know about my mother's true parentage? He knew, Martha confirmed. He was there the night Mary was born. He knew exactly who your mother was when he married her years later. And Judge Montgomery, Francis Hathaway, did they know too? They all knew. It was their secret, the thing that bound them together all these years. Martha's voice hardened. They built this town on blood money and a murdered woman's grave, and they've prospered from it ever since. Catherine turned back to face them, her expression transformed by a cold fury that reminded Elijah startlingly of George Hammond at his most resolute. Where is she buried? Where is Victoria? Martha pointed toward the old church. There's a large oak tree about 50 yards behind the cemetery wall. They buried her beneath it deep enough that no one would find her accidentally. And the strongbox mentioned in the Bible. Martha frowned. Strongbox? I don't know anything about that. Catherine exchanged a glance with Elijah. The Bible contained a coded message about proof being in a strongbox. We thought it might be buried with her. Not with her, Martha said, shaking her head. But Victoria did mention hiding something in the church before they caught her. Something that would prove what they'd done. Perhaps that's what the message refers to. Elijah considered this. The church burned down 15 years ago. If there was something hidden inside, it would be gone. Not necessarily, Martha countered. The fire destroyed the wooden structure, but the stone foundation remained. And beneath the church was a small cellar where they stored communion wine and church records. If Victoria hid something there, Catherine's eyes widened. It could still be there even now. Martha nodded. It's possible. The entrance to the cellar was through a trapdoor in what used to be the vestry at the back of the church. Elijah rose, decision made. We should check it before anyone realizes what we're looking for. Catherine nodded, her face set in determined lines. Yes, she turned to Martha. Thank you for telling us the truth. It can't have been easy to keep this secret all these years. It's been a weight on my soul every day, the old woman admitted. I should have spoken up long ago, but fear is a powerful thing. When you've seen what powerful men are capable of, she trailed off, then squared her shoulders. Take Victoria's journal. It contains the truth in her own words. And Catherine, be careful. Judge Montgomery still has considerable influence in this town. If he suspects what you know, He already does, Elijah said grimly. Walter Hammond was murdered because he was about to reveal the truth. Catherine's life is in danger too. Martha's expression grew troubled. Then you must act quickly. Find whatever Victoria hid and take it to someone who can't be bought or intimidated. The federal marshal in Helena, perhaps. Catherine tucked Victoria's journal into her pocket alongside the photograph. We will. She hesitated, then asked the question that must have been burning in her mind. Martha, do you know why my father decided to reveal the truth now, after all these years? The old woman's face softened with what might have been pity. I can't say for certain, but a few weeks ago Walter came to see me, asked about Victoria about that night. He seemed troubled, said something about sins coming back to haunt us all. She shook her head. Maybe his conscience finally caught up with him, or maybe he just couldn't bear the weight of the secret anymore. Elijah understood that feeling all too well. Some secrets grew heavier with time until carrying them became more painful than revealing them. Thank you, Martha, Catherine said again, her voice steadier now. For everything. As they prepared to leave, Martha caught Catherine's arm. Child, whatever you find, whatever you learn, remember that your father wasn't always the man who helped kill Victoria. People can change. They can regret. They can try to make amends. Catherine nodded, though the set of her jaw suggested she wasn't ready to forgive just yet. I'll remember. Outside, they paused at the edge of Martha's garden, looking back toward the church ruins. The oak tree Martha had mentioned was clearly visible, its massive trunk and spreading branches dominating the landscape beyond the cemetery wall. Which first? Elijah asked quietly. The cellar or the grave? Catherine stared at the oak tree for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The cellar, she said finally. If there's proof in a strongbox, we need to find it. For Victoria's sake. For justice. Elijah nodded, accepting her decision. Together, they made their way back to the church ruins, each step taking them deeper into a past neither of them had anticipated, a past that had already claimed 2 lives and threatened to claim more before the truth was fully revealed. Behind them, Martha Taylor watched from her cottage window, her aged face lined with worry. She had carried her secret for 20 years, protected the powerful men who had bought her silence. But as she watched Catherine Hammond walk toward the truth of her heritage, the old midwife crossed herself and whispered a prayer for forgiveness and for protection. For Martha knew better than most just how far Judge Clifford Montgomery would go to keep his secrets buried. The stone foundation of the old church rose from the earth like the bleached bones of some ancient creature. Time and the elements had worn away at the edges, while moss and creeping vines sought to reclaim what man had abandoned. It was a place caught between existence and memory, not fully gone, yet no longer truly present. Elijah and Catherine picked their way carefully through the ruins, alert for any sign of the cellar Martha had mentioned. The footprint of the church was modest, perhaps 40 feet long and 30 feet wide, with what remained of an altar space at the eastern end. At the western end, where Martha had indicated the vestry once stood, little remained but a pattern of flat stones that might have been a floor. There must be some indication of a trapdoor, Catherine murmured, kneeling to brush aside years of accumulated leaves and debris. Elijah surveyed the area with a soldier's eye, looking for anything that didn't belong, any pattern that broke the natural order of decay. The fire would have destroyed any wooden trapdoor, he noted, but there should still be a depression where the cellar itself is located. They worked methodically, clearing away the layers of detritus that had built up since the church burned. After several minutes of searching, Elijah noticed a slight difference in the vegetation growing between the stones, a rectangular area where the plants grew sparser and less robust. "Here," he called, dropping to one knee beside the spot. "The soil's different." Catherine joined him, and together they cleared the area more thoroughly, revealing a pattern of stones set in a distinct rectangle, roughly 3 feet by 4 feet. Unlike the foundation stones, these were fitted together without mortar, suggesting they had been laid to cover something beneath. "A stone trapdoor." Catherine breathed excitement, lighting her eyes. "Clever. It would have survived the fire." Elijah nodded, examining the edges of the stone rectangle. "Help me lift these," he said, sliding his fingers into a small gap between two of the stones. Together they managed to pry up the first stone, revealing darkness below. One by one they removed the stones until a black opening yawned before them, exhaling the cool, musty breath of a space long sealed. "I can't see anything," Catherine said, peering into the darkness. Elijah reached into his saddlebag and produced a small lantern. "Always come prepared," he said, lighting it with a match struck against the sole of his boot. The lantern cast a warm, golden glow that did little to penetrate the darkness below. A crude ladder of iron rungs embedded in the wall led down into the cellar, disappearing into the shadows. "I'll go first," Elijah said, passing the lantern to Catherine. "Hand this to me when I'm down." Catherine nodded, holding the light steady as Elijah lowered himself through the opening. The iron rungs were slick with moisture but held firm under his weight. The descent was short, perhaps 8 feet, and soon he stood on a packed earth floor, looking up at Catherine's face, haloed by daylight. "Pass me the lantern," he called softly, and she obliged, careful not to spill the precious light. With the lantern raised, Elijah surveyed the cellar. It was a simple, rectangular space, roughly the size of the vestry that had once stood above it. Wooden shelves blackened by smoke, but largely intact, lined the walls. A few dusty bottles still stood on one shelf, the communion wine Martha had mentioned. The rest of the shelves held an assortment of decaying boxes and mildewed books. "What do you see?" Catherine called down, her voice muffled. "Nothing immediately obvious," Elijah replied, "but there are shelves with some items still on them. Come down, but be careful. The rungs are slippery." Catherine descended nimbly, taking Elijah's offered hand for the final step. Once beside him, she took the lantern, raising it higher to cast light into the corners of the cellar. If Victoria hid something down here, where would she put it? She wondered aloud. Elijah considered the question. Somewhere not immediately obvious, but also somewhere she could access quickly. He examined the shelves more closely. "These look like church records," he said, indicating the row of decaying ledgers. "Baptisms, marriages, deaths. Would make sense for her to hide something among them." They began a methodical search of the shelves, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of objects that had remained undisturbed for decades. The air was thick with dust and the peculiar stillness of places long abandoned. It pressed against their skin, filled their lungs with each breath, a tangible reminder of the weight of time. After several minutes of fruitless searching, Catherine made a small sound of discovery. "Elijah, look at this." She had found a small alcove behind one of the shelves, concealed by a loose stone in the wall. Within the alcove sat a metal box roughly the size of a small book, green, with verdigris but intact. "The strong box," Elijah breathed. Catherine reached for it with trembling hands, but Elijah stopped her. "Wait, let me check for traps or triggers." She withdrew her hand, allowing Elijah to examine the alcove and the box carefully. Finding nothing suspicious, he nodded. "It seems safe." Catherine retrieved the box, bringing it into the lantern light. It was locked, but the lock was simple, a small latch that had long since corroded. With a firm twist, Elijah broke it open. Inside lay a bundle of papers protected from the elements by the tight seal of the box. Catherine set the lantern on a nearby shelf and carefully unwrapped the bundle. The papers were yellowed with age, but still legible. The ink faded to a rusty brown, but clear enough to read by the wavering lantern light. "Letters," Catherine said, scanning the first page, "between Judge Montgomery and my father, and financial records." She looked up, her eyes wide. "This is evidence of embezzlement. They were stealing from the reconstruction funds meant to rebuild the county after the war." Elijah peered over her shoulder at the documents. The letters were damning, explicit discussions of money diverted from government coffers, of falsified reports of bribes paid to ensure silence. And with each letter, the amounts grew larger, the schemes more elaborate. "This is what Victoria discovered," Elijah said grimly. "This is why they killed her." Catherine continued through the papers, her expression hardening as she read. "There's more," she said, her voice tight. Notes in Victoria's hand. She knew about the embezzlement, but she also knew something else. She held up a page covered in a delicate feminine script. She was going to expose them, but not just for the theft. "Listen to this. I have confronted Judge Montgomery with what I know about the funds." He laughed and said no one would believe a woman over men of their standing. But when I mentioned the fire at the Cartwright farm and what I had learned about it, he changed. The fear in his eyes told me I had stumbled upon something far worse than theft. Elijah frowned. "The Cartwright farm. I've never heard of it," Catherine admitted, continuing to read. "I believe the fire that killed the Cartwright family was no accident. Montgomery, Hammond, and Hathaway wanted their land for the railroad spur they were investing in. When Cartwright refused to sell, they took more direct action. I have no proof beyond what I overheard, but I believe they murdered an entire family for profit." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of this new revelation. The lantern flame flickered, casting monstrous shadows on the cellar walls, as if the very darkness were listening, remembering. "My God!" Catherine whispered, her voice breaking. "They were monsters, all of them." Elijah said nothing, watching as she processed this newest blow to her understanding of her family. The pain in her eyes was almost physical, a wound deeper than any bullet could inflict. "There's one more letter," she said, finally unfolding the last page in the bundle. "It's addressed to my child." Her hands shook as she read aloud. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found what I hid. I do not know who you are or when you will find this, but I hope you will use these documents to bring justice to those who have escaped it for too long. I am afraid as I write this that I have not much time left. They know I have discovered their secrets, and I have seen the cold calculation in their eyes. But I cannot run. I carry a child, your sibling, and I will not bring an innocent life into a world where such evil goes unpunished. If I die, let it not be in vain. Let justice be done at last. With love and hope, Victoria Winfield." Catherine lowered the letter, tears streaming freely down her face. "She knew they would kill her," she whispered. "And still she stayed, tried to fight them." Elijah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort he could. "She was brave," he said softly, "like her granddaughter." Catherine folded the letters carefully, returning them to the metal box. "We need to get these to the federal marshal in Helena," she said, her voice steadier now, "before Montgomery realizes what we've found." Elijah nodded in agreement. "We should leave immediately. The longer we stay in Red Creek, the greater the danger." They secured the box in Elijah's saddlebag and prepared to climb back up to daylight. Catherine went first with Elijah, close behind the lantern, extinguished and stowed away. As they emerged from the cellar into the bright afternoon light, a shadow fell across the opening. "Well now," drawled a familiar voice, "what have we here?" Sheriff Caleb Thornton stood at the edge of the cellar, opening his badge glinting in the sunlight, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered revolver. Beside him stood Lawrence Montgomery, the judge's son, his expression a careful mask of polite interest that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Miss Hammond," Lawrence said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "And Mr. Morgan. What an unexpected pleasure." Elijah moved subtly, positioning himself between Catherine and the two men. His hand hovered near his own weapon, though he knew drawing it would only escalate the situation. Sheriff Thornton might be in Montgomery's pocket, but he was still the law in Red Creek, and attacking a sheriff was a hanging offense. "Sheriff," Elijah nodded, keeping his voice neutral. "Mr. Montgomery, we're just exploring the old church ruins. Historical interest." Thornton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Is that right? Seems an odd pastime for a man who keeps to himself and a grieving daughter." Lawrence Montgomery stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the saddlebag where the metal box was hidden. "My father was wondering where you'd disappeared to Miss Hammond. He was concerned, what with your father's recent tragic death." Catherine straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "Please thank your father for his concern, Mr. Montgomery, but as you can see, I'm perfectly fine." "Indeed." Lawrence's smile was cold. "Though I must say the company you're keeping is rather unexpected. Mr. Morgan isn't known for his social nature." "Mr. Morgan was a friend of my grandfather's," Catherine replied smoothly. "He's been kind enough to share some stories about him." Elijah admired her quick thinking, though he doubted either Thornton or Montgomery was convinced. The tension in the air was palpable, a stretched wire ready to snap. "Well, ain't that touching," Thornton drawled, "but I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you both to come with me. Judge Montgomery would like a word." "On what grounds, Sheriff?" Catherine challenged. "We've broken no laws." Thornton's hand tightened on his gun. "No grounds needed when the judge wants to see you, Miss Hammond. That's how things work in Red Creek." Elijah felt the situation slipping away from them. They couldn't afford to be taken to Judge Montgomery, not with Victoria's evidence in their possession. But neither could they simply flee. Thornton might be corrupt, but he was still a lawman, and Lawrence Montgomery was from one of the most powerful families in the territory. "I'm afraid we'll have to decline," Elijah said calmly. "Miss Hammond isn't feeling well, and I've promised to see her safely home." Lawrence's eyes narrowed. "That wasn't a request, Morgan." "Neither was my response, Montgomery." The air between them crackled with unspoken threat. Lawrence's hand moved toward his coat where Elijah suspected he carried a concealed weapon. Thornton's fingers twitched on his holstered revolver. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, then tipped suddenly as a new voice called out from beyond the church ruins. "Mr. Montgomery, Sheriff, there's smoke coming from the direction of town." One of Thornton's deputies appeared at the edge of the clearing, his face flushed with exertion. "Fire's broken out near the courthouse. Judge Montgomery sent me to find you. He says it's urgent." Thornton and Lawrence exchanged quick glances. Fire was one of the greatest dangers in a frontier town like Red Creek, where wooden buildings stood close together, and water was often scarce. "This isn't over," Lawrence said quietly, his gaze fixed on Elijah. Then louder, "We're coming, deputy." As they turned to leave, Lawrence paused, looking back at Catherine. "My condolences again on your father's passing, Miss Hammond. Such a tragedy." His tone made the words a threat rather than a comfort. "I do hope nothing similar befalls you." Then they were gone, hurrying after the deputy toward town, where a column of dark smoke now rose visibly above the treetops. Catherine let out a shaky breath. That was too close. And too convenient, Elijah added, frowning at the smoke in the distance. That fire started at exactly the right moment to draw them away. You think it was deliberate? I think we shouldn't question our good fortune. He secured the saddlebag more firmly. We need to leave now while they're distracted. Helena is a 2-day ride, but if we push hard we can reach Miller's Crossing by nightfall. There's a stagecoach from there to Helena. Catherine nodded but hesitated. Wait, there's one more thing we need to do before we leave. She turned toward the massive oak tree Martha had pointed out. We need to find Victoria's grave. I can't leave without knowing for certain where she is. Elijah wanted to argue to insist they flee while they had the chance, but the determination in Catherine's eyes stopped him. This wasn't just about evidence or justice anymore. It was about family, about honoring the grandmother she'd never known existed until today. Quickly, then, he conceded. But at the first sign of trouble, we leave immediately. They made their way to the oak tree, a giant sentinel that must have been ancient even when Victoria was buried beneath it. Its massive roots spread out like gnarled fingers, digging into the earth, and its canopy cast dappled shadows on the ground below. Martha said they buried her deep, Catherine said, scanning the area around the tree's base. But there must be some sign, some marker. They circled the tree slowly, looking for any indication of disturbed earth, any pattern that didn't belong. The ground was covered with a thick carpet of fallen leaves and moss, obscuring whatever might lie beneath. Here, Elijah said, finally pointing to a small flat stone half buried at the base of the tree. This doesn't belong. Catherine knelt beside the stone, brushing away leaves to reveal a crude etching, the letters VW, and a simple cross, nothing more. Victoria Winfield, she whispered, tracing the letters with her fingertips. They gave her this much, at least. A marker, however small. Elijah stood silent, allowing her this moment of connection with the grandmother she'd never known. The woman whose blood ran in her veins, whose courage had ultimately led to her own death, and whose secrets had finally come to light after 20 years of darkness. Catherine bowed her head, her lips moving in a silent prayer or promise, Elijah couldn't tell which. Then she rose, her expression resolute. Now we can go, she said, her voice steady. I needed to see her resting place, to make it real. But we'll come back when this is over. Give her a proper burial, a proper marker. She deserves that much. Elijah nodded, understanding. Some ghosts could never be fully laid to rest until they were properly acknowledged, properly honored. He knew that better than most. They set off toward where Elijah had left his horse, moving swiftly but cautiously through the woods. The smoke from town was still visible, a dark smudge against the blue sky, but whether it was a blessing or a warning remained to be seen. They rode double on Elijah's horse, pushing the animal as hard as they dared through the dense forest that surrounded Red Creek. Elijah had chosen a route that avoided the main roads, relying on old hunting trails and game paths that only a local would know. Catherine sat behind him, the metal box secured in the saddlebag between them, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across their path. Birds called to one another in the branches overhead, and occasionally they startled a deer or rabbit from cover. The forest was alive with the sounds of life going about its business, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within its bounds. "Do you think they'll follow us?" Catherine asked, her voice close to Elijah's ear, to be heard over the sound of the horse's hooves. "Eventually," Elijah replied grimly. "Once they realize what we've found, they'll have no choice. Montgomery has too much to lose." They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts, as the miles passed beneath them. Elijah's shoulder ached from the combination of his healing wound and the strain of controlling the horse on the uneven terrain, but he pushed the pain aside, focusing on the path ahead. They had been traveling for perhaps 2 hours when Elijah reined the horse to a stop, listening intently. Catherine tensed behind him, her hands tightening around his waist. "What is it?" she whispered. "Riders," Elijah said softly. "Behind us. At least 3, maybe 4. Catherine strained to hear what had caught Elijah's attention. At first she heard only the normal sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the call of birds. Then faintly came the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats and the occasional crack of a branch. "They found us quickly," she murmured, a note of fear creeping into her voice. "They know these woods as well as I do," Elijah said, "and they're not trying to be quiet. They want us to know they're coming." He urged the horse forward again, pushing a bit faster now that stealth was no longer an option. The animal responded gamely, but Elijah could feel it tiring beneath them. They had already asked much of it, and carrying double weight over rough terrain was taking its toll. "We won't outrun them like this," he said after another mile. "Not with both of us on one horse." Catherine understood the implication immediately. "I'm not leaving you behind, Elijah."
Not suggesting you do.
He guided the horse off the trail toward a small stream that cut through the forest. "But we need to split up, confuse the trail. They'll expect us to continue toward Miller's Crossing. If we separate, one of us might make it through." The sound of pursuit was growing louder now, the riders gaining ground with their fresh mounts. Catherine's grip on Elijah tightened, but she nodded against his back. "Where will we meet?" she asked. "There's an abandoned trapper's cabin about 5 miles east of here," Elijah said, dismounting and helping Catherine down. "Near the old copper mine. You know it." Catherine nodded. "I think so. My father took me hunting in these woods once." "Good." Elijah reached into the saddlebag, retrieving the metal box. "Take this. Head east along the stream for about half a mile, then cut north. The water will hide your trail for a while." Catherine took the box, clutching it to her chest. "What about you? I'll lead them south, make them think we're both heading for the border." He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. "Get to the cabin, wait until dawn. If I'm not there by then, make your way to Helena alone." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. Her jaw set with determination. "I'll wait for you." Elijah hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, the tarnished cavalry badge he'd kept hidden all these years. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her hand. "It belonged to your grandfather. If anything happens, it might help convince the marshal in Helena to listen to you." Catherine stared at the badge recognition dawning in her eyes. "You knew him well, didn't you? Not just as fellow soldiers." "Better than most," Elijah admitted. "But that's a story for another time. Now go quickly." She hesitated just a moment longer, then stepped forward and pressed a swift kiss to his cheek. "Be careful, Elijah. I've lost too much already." Before he could respond, she turned and hurried away, following the stream eastward, the metal box clutched tightly in her arms. Elijah watched until she disappeared among the trees, then mounted his horse again and headed deliberately south, making no effort to hide his trail. The pursuers were close now, perhaps 10 minutes behind. Elijah smiled grimly to himself as he urged his tired mount into a faster pace. Let them follow him. Every minute they spent chasing him was another minute Catherine had to escape with the evidence. As he rode, Elijah found himself reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. A week ago, he'd been content in his solitude, his only concerns the daily routines of survival, and the occasional ghost of memory that haunted his dreams. Now he was galloping through the forest, pursuers at his heels, risking his life for a woman he barely knew and a decades-old secret he'd never imagined. But it felt right somehow, as if the path he'd been on for 20 years had always been leading to this moment, this choice. Perhaps this was the redemption he'd never sought, but always needed, not for Rebecca's death, which had been beyond his control, but for the life he'd abandoned in the wake of it. The sound of pursuit grew louder, and Elijah glanced back to see the first of the riders emerging from the trees behind him. Sheriff Thornton, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Beside him rode Lawrence Montgomery, his face set in grim lines. And behind them, 2 deputies, their expressions blank with the obedience of men following orders without question. Elijah turned forward again, spurring his horse to greater speed. He had no illusions about what would happen if they caught him. Montgomery wasn't the type to ask questions first, and Thornton was too deeply in the judge's pocket to intervene. The forest began to thin, giving way to more open ground, a risk as it would allow his pursuers to use their fresher mounts to full advantage, but also an opportunity. In the dense woods, a bullet from behind might find him at any moment. In the open, at least, he would see it coming. Emerging from the tree line, Elijah found himself at the edge of a wide meadow, golden with late summer grasses. Beyond it lay another stretch of forest, darker and denser than the one they'd just left. If he could reach those woods, he might yet lose his pursuers. He urged his horse forward, the animal's sides heaving with exertion as it galloped across the open ground. Behind him, Thornton and Montgomery burst from the tree line, shouting when they spotted him. Halfway across the meadow, the crack of a rifle shot split the air. Elijah ducked instinctively, but the bullet went wide, kicking up dirt several yards to his right. Another shot followed closer this time, and Elijah leaned lower over his horse's neck, making himself a smaller target. The far tree line was approaching rapidly now, the dark shelter of the forest tantalizingly close. 30 yards. 20. 10. Just as Elijah was about to reach the safety of the trees, a third shot rang out. This one found its mark, striking the horse in the flank. The animal screamed a terrible human-like sound of pain and fear and stumbled, its stride broken. Momentum carried them forward a few more steps, and then the horse collapsed, pitching Elijah forward into the tall grass at the edge of the forest. He rolled with the fall years of training taking over to minimize the impact. Still, the landing knocked the breath from his lungs and sent a shock of pain through his wounded shoulder. For a moment, he lay stunned, the world spinning around him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats roused him. With a groan, Elijah pushed himself to his knees, then to his feet. His rifle was gone, lost in the fall, but he still had his revolver. He drew it, checking that it was loaded, then staggered into the trees, using the brief cover provided by his fallen horse to mask his movement. Once in the forest, he moved as quickly and quietly as his battered body would allow, heading deeper into the shadows. Behind him, he heard Thornton and Montgomery reach his horse, their voices raised in anger when they realized he'd escaped on foot. "Spread out!" Thornton shouted. "He can't have gone far!" Elijah pressed on, ignoring the pain that radiated from his shoulder with each step. He had no illusions about outrunning mounted men for long, but he might be able to find a defensible position, make a stand if necessary. The forest grew darker around him, the trees older and more massive, their canopy blocking out much of the late afternoon sunlight. The ground was soft underfoot, carpeted with pine needles and moss that muffled his footsteps. The air was cooler here, heavy with the scent of damp earth and growing things. After several minutes of steady movement, Elijah paused, listening. The sounds of pursuit were faint now, spread out, as the riders searched the forest. They were being methodical, working in a pattern to cover as much ground as possible. professional, dangerous. Elijah considered his options. Continuing to run would only tire him further, making him easier to catch. Fighting was a last resort. 4 against 1 were poor odds, especially with his injured shoulder. Hiding seemed the best choice, at least, until darkness fell and gave him better cover for escape. He looked around, assessing the terrain. Nearby, a massive fallen tree created a natural barrier, its upturned roots forming a tangled wall of earth and vegetation. Behind it, a small depression in the ground offered a space just large enough for a man to conceal himself. Elijah moved to the fallen tree and crawled into the space behind the roots, pulling loose branches and vegetation over himself for additional cover. From this position, he could see anyone approaching from the direction of the meadow, but they would have to be almost on top of him to spot him. He settled in to wait, controlling his breathing to remain as silent as possible. The forest continued its quiet symphony around him, birds calling, insects buzzing, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Normal sounds that would mask his presence from all but the most observant searcher. Time passed slowly. The forest grew dimmer as the sun sank toward the horizon, shadows lengthening and deepening. Elijah remained motionless, listening to the sounds of his pursuers moving through the woods. They were still searching, but the methodical pattern had broken down somewhat, the riders growing frustrated as darkness approached. "It's getting too dark to track him," Thornton's voice carried from somewhere to Elijah's left. "We should head back, try again at first light." "We can't leave him out here," Lawrence Montgomery replied, anger evident in his tone. "He knows too much." "He's on foot in unfamiliar territory, probably wounded," Thornton argued. "Even if he survives the night, he won't get far. We'll pick up his trail in the morning." There was a long silence. Then Montgomery spoke again, his voice colder than before. "And the woman, where's she in all this?" "Probably with him," Thornton replied. "Or waiting somewhere for him to join her. Either way, we find Morgan, we find her." "And the items they took from the church?" "Morgan had saddlebags when we spotted him. Whatever they found, he had it with him." Elijah allowed himself a small smile in the darkness. They didn't know Catherine had separated from him, didn't know she carried the evidence. It was a small advantage, but possibly a crucial one. "Very well," Montgomery conceded finally. "We'll return at dawn. But understand this, Sheriff, neither Morgan nor the Hammond woman can be allowed to reach Helena. My father was very clear on that point." "I understand, Mr. Montgomery." Their voices faded as they moved away, heading back toward the meadow. Elijah remained in his hiding place, not trusting that they had truly given up the search. His caution was rewarded when, perhaps 10 minutes later, he heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching his position. A lone figure moved through the gathering darkness, rifle held ready. One of the deputies left behind to continue the search, or perhaps to watch for any movement in the night. The man moved with the careful precision of an experienced hunter. Eyes scanning the forest floor for tracks, ears alert for any sound out of place. Elijah held his breath as the deputy passed within a few yards of his hiding place. The man paused, sensing something, and turned slowly in Elijah's direction. For a heart-stopping moment, Elijah thought he'd been spotted. His hand tightened on his revolver, ready to fight if necessary. But after a tense moment, the deputy turned away, continuing his patrol of the area. Elijah released his breath slowly, silently, and settled in for a long night. They hadn't abandoned the search completely, which meant his escape would be more challenging than he'd hoped. As full darkness descended on the forest, Elijah allowed his thoughts to turn to Catherine. Had she reached the trapper's cabin safely? Would she wait for him as promised, or flee to Helena alone if he didn't arrive by dawn? He hoped for the latter, even as something in him longed for the former. Catherine Hammond had awakened something in him that he'd thought long dead, a desire for connection, for purpose, beyond mere survival. But her safety and the justice she sought for Victoria Winfield was more important than his newfound feelings. If he didn't make it to the cabin by dawn, he hoped she would have the sense to go on without him. The night grew colder, a damp chill settling over the forest. Elijah pulled his coat tighter around himself, grateful for the insulating layer of pine needles beneath him. The moon rose, casting silvery light through gaps in the canopy above, creating a patchwork of light and shadow on the forest floor. The deputy continued his patrol, moving in a widening circle from Elijah's position. Eventually, the man's footsteps faded entirely, suggesting he had either moved too far away to hear or had settled into a position to wait out the night. Elijah knew he should attempt to slip away under cover of darkness, to put as much distance as possible between himself and his pursuers before dawn. But exhaustion and the pain from his wounds made the decision for him. If he tried to move now in his weakened state, he would make noise, leave an obvious trail. Better to rest while he could regain some strength for the journey ahead. He shifted slightly, finding a more comfortable position within his hiding place, and closed his eyes. He wouldn't allow himself to truly sleep. That would be too dangerous. But he could rest, drifting in the space between wakefulness and dreams, where memories and hopes intertwined. In that twilight state, he saw Rebecca's face smiling at him as she had on their wedding day. Saw George Hammond raising a cup in toast across a campfire during a rare, peaceful night in the midst of war. Saw Catherine, her eyes flashing with determination as she uncovered the truth about her family. Past and present, woven together in the fabric of his life. Choices made and unmade, paths taken and abandoned. And perhaps, if he survived the night, a future he hadn't dared to imagine awaiting him. Catherine Hammond moved through the deepening twilight with the careful precision of prey evading a predator. The metal box was tucked securely inside her dress, pressed against her stomach, and held in place by her belt. George Hammond's cavalry badge was pinned to the inside of her bodice, close to her heart. She had followed Elijah's directions, precisely wading upstream for half a mile before cutting north through the dense forest. The stream had been cold, soaking her skirts and making them heavy, but it would confuse her trail, buying precious time. After leaving the water, she had moved as quickly as quiet would allow, grateful for the lessons her father had taught her about moving through wilderness. Walter Hammond had been many things, some of them she now knew monstrous, but he had also been a father who believed his daughter should be able to survive in a harsh world. He had taught her to ride, to shoot, to navigate by stars and landmarks. Skills that had seemed like games in her childhood were now the difference between life and death. The thought of her father brought a complex wash of emotions, grief, anger, betrayal, confusion. The man who had raised her, who had read her bedtime stories and taught her to balance account books, had also participated in the murder of a pregnant woman, had helped bury Victoria Winfield, Catherine's own grandmother, beneath an oak tree with only a crude marker to acknowledge her existence. How could she reconcile these two versions of Walter Hammond, the loving if distant father and the young man capable of such cruelty? And what did it say about her that his blood ran in her veins? No, not his blood, she reminded herself. Mary's blood, Victoria's blood. She was their descendant, not Walter's. The realization was both strange and comforting. The forest grew darker around her as the sun set the trees, becoming shadowy sentinels in the gathering gloom. Catherine paused occasionally to get her bearings, using the North Star as it appeared in breaks in the canopy to ensure she was still traveling in the right direction. It was fully dark by the time she spotted the trapper's cabin, nestled in a small clearing ahead. The structure was crude but solid, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney on one side. No light showed from its single window, and for a moment Catherine feared she had come to the wrong place. But as she approached cautiously, she recognized the description Elijah had given her. This was the place. She circled the cabin once, checking for any sign that someone else had arrived before her, but found nothing disturbing. The door was secured with a simple wooden latch, easily lifted from the outside. Catherine hesitated before entering, listening intently for any sound that might indicate the cabin was occupied. Hearing nothing, she pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the creak of rusty hinges. The interior was pitch black and smelled of dust and abandonment. Catherine fumbled in her pocket for the matches. She always carried, another habit instilled by her practical father, and struck one against the doorframe. The small flame illuminated a Spartan space: a rough wooden table and chair, a narrow cot against one wall, a small stone fireplace. Cobwebs draped from the rafters, and a layer of dust covered everything undisturbed for what might have been years. The match burned down to her fingers, and Catherine lit another, using it to locate a stub of candle on the table. Once the candle was lit, she closed the door behind her and secured it with the interior bolt, a flimsy defense, but better than nothing. The cabin was cold, the spring night chill seeping through the gaps in the log walls. Catherine found a small stack of firewood beside the fireplace, dusty but dry enough to burn. She built a small fire, careful to keep it low to minimize smoke that might be visible from outside. Once the flames caught, she warmed her hands over them, feeling some of the tension drain from her body. She was safe for the moment. The evidence was secure. Now she just had to wait for Elijah to join her, or for dawn to arrive, whichever came first. Catherine removed the metal box from its hiding place and set it on the table. Opening it, she spread out Victoria's papers, reading them more carefully now that she had proper light and a safe place to examine them. The evidence against Montgomery, her father, and Hathaway was even more damning than she'd initially realized. Not only had they embezzled reconstruction funds, but they had used that money to buy land and influence throughout the county, building their fortunes on theft, and, in the Cartwright's case, murder. But it was Victoria's journal that captured Catherine's attention most completely. The woman's handwriting was elegant but strong, her observations keen, her moral outrage palpable even across the decades. She wrote of coming to Red Creek with hopes of building a new life after the war, of finding purpose in educating the children of both settlers and the few remaining native families in the area. She described her first meetings with the three men who would eventually kill her: Walter Hammond, young and ambitious, newly returned from the war; Clifford Montgomery, already establishing himself as a power in the territory; Francis Hathaway, charming and ruthless, with dreams of a railroad empire. Victoria had been initially impressed by their vision for Red Creek's future, their plans to bring prosperity to the remote community. But gradually, she had begun to notice discrepancies between the public funds that were supposed to be arriving for rebuilding and the actual improvements being made. Questions were deflected, concerns dismissed. When she pressed harder, the three men had tried to charm her into silence, offering her a position as the headmistress of a school they promised to build. When charm failed, they had resorted to threats. Victoria wrote of her growing fear, but also of her determination to expose what she had discovered. "I cannot be party to theft from those who have already lost so much in the war," she wrote. "Nor can I ignore the greater crime of the Cartwrights' deaths. To remain silent is to be complicit." The final entries were heartbreaking in their prescience. Victoria knew she was in danger, knew that her refusal to be silenced might cost her everything. Yet she persisted, driven by a moral clarity that transcended fear. "I think often of the child I carry, Read the last entry dated just 2 days before Martha said Victoria was killed. What world will he or she be born into? One where powerful men can commit crimes with impunity, or one where justice prevails? I must believe in the latter, must work toward it even at great personal risk. For what is life worth if lived in the shadow of cowardice? Catherine wiped away tears as she carefully refolded the journal. Victoria Winfield had been brave beyond measure, had died for her principles, had given birth to Catherine's mother with her last breaths. And now, 20 years later, Catherine had the opportunity to fulfill Victoria's final wish, to bring justice to those who had escaped it for too long. Judge Montgomery was the only one of the 3 murderers still alive. Walter Hammond was dead killed, Catherine now suspected on Montgomery's orders when he threatened to reveal the truth. Frances Hathaway had died years ago in a hunting accident, though Catherine now wondered if that accident had truly been accidental. But Montgomery lived prospering from his crimes, his position as judge protecting him from scrutiny. His son Lawrence walked in his father's footsteps, wearing the mantle of respectability while serving the cause of corruption. Catherine's thoughts turned to Elijah Morgan, who had been drawn into this web of secrets and violence through no fault of his own. He had promised only 1 day of his help, yet had risked his life to ensure she escaped with the evidence. She prayed he had eluded his pursuers, that he would arrive safely before dawn. And if he didn't, Catherine's jaw set with determination. Then she would continue alone, would make her way to Helena, and place Victoria's evidence in the hands of the federal marshal. Would see justice done, no matter the personal cost. Outside, the night deepened the forest, falling into the profound silence of midnight. Catherine added another small log to the fire, careful to keep the flames low. She was exhausted, the events of the day catching up with her all at once, but she dared not sleep deeply. Instead, she settled into the chair by the fire, Victoria's journal in her lap, and allowed herself to drift, waking at the slightest sound from the forest outside. At some point, she must have fallen into a deeper sleep, for she woke with a start to the sound of footsteps approaching the cabin. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the interior in a dull red glow. Outside, the night was still dark, though a faint lightening at the eastern edge of the sky suggested dawn wasn't far off. Catherine rose silently, gathering the papers and returning them to the metal box. She retrieved her derringer from her pocket, moving to stand beside the door, out of sight of anyone who might enter. The footsteps drew closer, then stopped just outside the cabin. A moment of silence, then a soft knock. "Catherine?" Elijah's voice low and tired. "It's me." Relief flooded through her, but caution kept her from rushing to open the door. "Prove it," she called softly. "Tell me something only Elijah Morgan would know." A soft chuckle from the other side of the door. "Smart girl. The badge I gave you belonged to your grandfather. He gave it to me at Gettysburg after he saved my life." Catherine unbolted the door, opening it to find Elijah standing there, haggard and mud-stained, but alive. His clothes were torn in several places, and fresh blood had seeped through the bandage on his shoulder, but his eyes were clear and alert. "You made it," she breathed, stepping back to allow him inside. Elijah entered, securing the door behind him. "Barely. Montgomery's men were more persistent than I expected. Left a deputy watching the woods all night." "But you lost him." "Eventually." Elijah moved to the fire, adding wood to bring the flames back to life. "Waited until he dozed off near dawn, then slipped away. But they'll be searching again as soon as it's fully light." Catherine handed him a canteen of water she'd filled from the stream before entering the cabin. "We need to leave soon, then." Elijah drank deeply, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Yes, but not for Helena." Catherine frowned. "What do you mean, We need to get the evidence to the federal marshal. And we will. Elijah settled wearily into the chair she had vacated. But not directly. Montgomery will have men watching every road and trail to Helena. That's where he'll expect us to go. So where do we go instead? West to Fort Ellis. It's a longer journey, but there's a telegraph office there. We can wire the marshal in Helena, have him send deputies to meet us. Catherine considered the plan. It made sense. Fort Ellis was an active military post, a place where Montgomery's influence would be limited. How far is it? 3 days' hard ride if we push. Elijah glanced at her torn and muddy dress. And we'll need supplies. Food, fresh clothing, for you a horse. Where will we get all that? Elijah's expression grew thoughtful. There's a homestead about 10 miles west of here. Family named Wilson. Good people. The husband James served with me in the war. They might be willing to help. Catherine nodded, relieved to have a plan. When do we leave? As soon as there's enough light to travel safely. Elijah looked up at her, his expression softening. You should rest while you can. I'll keep watch. Catherine shook her head. You're exhausted, wounded. You need rest more than I do. I've gone longer without sleep in worse conditions, Elijah countered. Besides, I doubt I could sleep now anyway. Catherine recognized the stubborn set of his jaw and decided not to argue. Instead, she settled onto the narrow cot, Victoria's journal still clutched in her hand. Wake me in an hour, then. We'll take turns. Elijah nodded, though she suspected he had no intention of waking her until it was time to leave. It was frustrating, this protectiveness, but also strangely comforting. In the space of 2 days, Elijah Morgan had become the one person in the world she trusted completely, an irony not lost on Catherine, given how little she actually knew about him. Elijah, she said softly, as sleep began to tug at her consciousness. Thank you for everything. His response was so quiet, she almost missed it. No need for thanks between friends, Catherine. Get some rest now. As she drifted into sleep, Catherine found herself thinking of Victoria again, of the courage that had driven her to stand against powerful men, to risk everything for what was right. And of Elijah Morgan, who had chosen to stand with Catherine when he could have simply walked away. Perhaps, she thought, as sleep claimed her, that was what real strength looked like. Not the power to intimidate or control, but the will to do what was right, regardless of the cost. Victoria had understood that, and so it seemed, did Elijah Morgan. Dawn broke over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in delicate strokes of pink and gold. Elijah and Catherine left the trapper's cabin as the first light filtered through the trees, moving cautiously through the forest. Elijah led the way, his rifle ready, every sense alert for signs of pursuit. Catherine followed close behind, the metal box containing Victoria's evidence secured once more inside her dress. They traveled in silence, conserving energy for the journey ahead. The forest was peaceful in the early morning light, dew sparkling on leaves and spider webs, birds greeting the day with cheerful songs. It was hard to reconcile such tranquility with the danger that followed them like a shadow. By mid-morning, they had covered several miles, angling westward as Elijah had suggested. The terrain gradually changed from dense forest to more open woodland interspersed with small meadows. In one such clearing, Elijah paused, studying the ground carefully. Riders passed through here recently, he said, indicating the crushed grass and disturbed earth. 4, maybe 5 horses, heading west. Catherine felt her heart sink. Montgomery's men, possibly. Elijah frowned, surveying the surrounding trees. Or just travelers heading to Fort Ellis. Either way, we need to be more careful. They altered their course slightly, staying under the cover of trees whenever possible, avoiding open ground. The day grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, and despite the cool spring air, sweat dampened Catherine's dress and plastered loose strands of hair to her forehead. Her feet, unused to such prolonged hiking, developed painful blisters, but she said nothing, determined not to slow their progress. Elijah noticed her discomfort nonetheless. "We'll rest soon," he promised, his voice gentler than she'd yet heard it. "There's a stream about half a mile ahead where we can stop for water." Catherine nodded gratefully. "I'm fine," she insisted, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. The stream, when they reached it, was a welcome sight, clear water tumbling over smooth stones, creating small pools where they could rest and refill their canteen. Catherine sank gratefully onto a fallen log, removing her shoes to examine her blistered feet. "Here," Elijah said, kneeling beside the stream. He soaked his bandana in the cold water, wringing it out before handing it to her. "For your feet, it'll help with the swelling." Catherine accepted the damp cloth with a nod of thanks. "How's your shoulder?" she asked, as she wrapped it around her most painful blister. Elijah flexed the joint experimentally. "Stiff, but the bleeding's stopped. I've had worse." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, resting their tired bodies while remaining alert to their surroundings. Catherine studied Elijah's profile as he scanned the forest edge, the strong line of his jaw now covered with several days' worth of stubble. The crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, evidence of a life lived largely outdoors. The watchful intensity that never seemed to leave him entirely. "You remind me of my mother sometimes," she said, suddenly surprising herself with the observation. Elijah turned to her, eyebrows raised. "How so?" Catherine smiled faintly. She had that same way of being present and far away at the same time, like she was constantly listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. She paused, the memory bittersweet. "I used to think it was because she missed her parents, the Edwards family who raised her. Now I wonder if somehow she sensed there was more to her story than she knew." Elijah considered this. "Some things run deeper than conscious memory," he said finally. "The body remembers what the mind doesn't." "Is that why you became a hermit?" Catherine asked, her tone gentle but direct. "Because your body remembered something your mind wanted to forget." The question hung between them, surprisingly intimate. For a moment Catherine thought she'd overstepped, that Elijah would retreat behind the walls he'd built so carefully over the years. But instead he sighed, his gaze turning to the flowing stream. "After Rebecca died, I couldn't bear the sympathy in people's eyes," he said quietly. "Or worse, the pity. Every conversation was an exercise in restraint, them trying not to mention her, me trying to act as if I were still whole." He picked up a small stone, turning it over in his fingers. "It was easier to leave, to go somewhere no one knew me, or what I'd lost." Catherine understood that impulse all too well. "After my mother died, I wanted to run away too, but I had my father, and he needed me even if he couldn't say so." "You're stronger than I was then," Elijah said, skipping the stone across the water's surface. It bounced 4 times before sinking. "Not stronger, just different circumstances." Catherine adjusted the damp cloth on her foot. "Besides, look at you now. You could have stayed in your cabin, kept your head down. Instead, you're risking your life to help a woman you barely know uncover a 20-year-old murder." Elijah's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "When you put it that way, it sounds like I've lost my mind." Catherine laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. "Perhaps we both have." The moment of levity was brief, but welcome. A small respite from the tension that had been their constant companion. As Catherine replaced her shoes and stood, she felt somehow lighter, as if sharing that small confidence with Elijah had relieved a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. They continued westward, making good time despite their fatigue. The landscape gradually changed again, forest giving way to rolling hills dotted with stands of pine and aspen. By late afternoon, they crested a hill and saw spread before them a small valley nestled between protective ridges. In the center of the valley sat a modest farmhouse surrounded by neat fields and a small orchard. Smoke rose from the chimney, curling lazily into the clear spring sky. "Wilson's farm," Elijah said, pointing to the homestead. "They've done well for themselves since I was here last." Catherine followed his gaze, taking in the peaceful scene, so different from the opulent homes of Red Creek's elite, yet somehow more substantial, more real. "Do you think they'll help us?" "James Wilson owes me his life," Elijah said simply. "Though that was a long time ago." "What happened?" Elijah's expression turned distant. "Antietam. His regiment was pinned down by Confederate fire. I led a charge that cleared the enemy position." He shrugged as if dismissing the memory. "He took a bullet meant for me in the process." Catherine studied him with new eyes. Elijah Morgan, it seemed, had hidden depths she was only beginning to glimpse. "You were an officer. Captain by the end of the war." Elijah adjusted his rifle strap, avoiding her gaze. "It doesn't matter now. Let's go see if the Wilsons are still as hospitable as I remember." They approached the farm cautiously, staying within the tree line until they were certain no one was watching the property. When they were satisfied it was safe, they emerged from cover and walked openly toward the farmhouse, Elijah slightly ahead. His posture alert but deliberately non-threatening. A dog barked as they approached, and a moment later the farmhouse door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair streaked with gray, and the sturdy build of someone accustomed to hard work. "Hello there," she called, her voice friendly but cautious. "Can I help you folks?" Elijah stopped at the edge of the yard, keeping a respectful distance. "Mrs. Wilson, my name is Elijah Morgan. I served with your husband in the war." The woman's expression changed from wariness to surprise. "Captain Morgan, James has spoken of you often." She turned her head, calling back into the house. "James, come quick." A moment later, a tall man with a pronounced limp appeared in the doorway. He was lean and weathered, with kind eyes set in a face mapped by sun and hardship. At the sight of Elijah, those eyes widened in recognition. "Good God," he breathed. "Elijah Morgan, as I live and breathe." He limped down the porch steps, moving faster than his disability would suggest possible, and strode across the yard with his hand outstretched. Elijah stepped forward to meet him, clasping the offered hand firmly. "James," he greeted, a genuine smile warming his face. "It's been too long." 15 years at least, James Wilson agreed, pumping Elijah's hand enthusiastically. "Not since you passed through on your way west after the war." His gaze shifted to Catherine, curiosity evident in his expression. "This is Miss Catherine Hammond," Elijah introduced. "Catherine, this is James Wilson and his wife, Sarah," the woman supplied, coming to join her husband. She extended a hand to Catherine, her handshake firm and confident. "Any friend of Elijah's is welcome here. Come inside, both of you. You look like you could use a hot meal and a rest." The interior of the farmhouse was as neat and welcoming as its exterior. A large kitchen with a wood stove, comfortable furnishings, worn but well-maintained walls, adorned with simple artwork and family photographs. A teenage boy and girl, clearly the Wilsons' children, watched with curious eyes as the strangers were ushered to the kitchen table. "Ben, fetch some water for our guests," Sarah directed the boy. Mary set 2 more places for supper. To Elijah and Catherine she added, "I hope you're hungry. James shot a deer yesterday, and the venison stew's been simmering all day." The normality of it all, the warm kitchen, the family going about their evening routine, The promise of a home-cooked meal felt almost surreal after the events of the past few days. Catherine caught Elijah's eye across the table, seeing in his expression a reflection of her own sense of displacement. "Now," James said once they were settled with cups of cool water before them. "What brings you to our corner of the territory, Elijah? Last I heard you were living like a hermit up near Red Creek." Elijah glanced at Catherine, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, trusting his judgment about how much to reveal. "We're in some trouble, James," Elijah said, his voice low, despite the apparent safety of their surroundings. "The kind that involves powerful men and old secrets." James's expression grew serious. "What kind of trouble? The kind that got Catherine's father killed and nearly got us killed too." Over the next hour, as Sarah served bowls of rich venison stew and fresh-baked bread, Elijah and Catherine took turns explaining their situation: the murder of Walter Hammond, the discovery of the Bible and its coded message, Martha Taylor's revelations about Victoria Winfield, and the evidence they'd uncovered implicating Judge Montgomery in decades of corruption and murder. The Wilsons listened intently, their expressions growing increasingly grim as the story unfolded. When Catherine explained that Victoria had been her grandmother murdered while pregnant with Catherine's mother, Sarah reached across the table to clasp her hand in sympathy. "That poor woman," she murmured. "And you, my dear, what a burden to carry." James's focus was more practical. "Montgomery has influence throughout the territory. If what you say is true, he won't stop hunting you." He looked to Elijah. "You plan to take this evidence to the federal marshal in Helena?" Elijah nodded. "Eventually. But we think Montgomery will have men watching the roads there. We thought to head for Fort Ellis instead, send a telegram to the marshal from there." James considered this, absently rubbing his wounded leg. "Fort Ellis is a good 40 miles from here. 3 days' hard ride, as you said. And there's open country between here and there, not much cover if someone's tracking you." "We don't have much choice," Catherine said. "We need to get this evidence to the authorities before Montgomery finds us." "There might be another way," James said slowly. "The supply wagon from Fort Ellis passes about 5 miles north of here, every other Thursday, on its way back from Helena. Tomorrow's Thursday." Elijah straightened hope kindling in his eyes. "The wagon would take us directly to the fort." James nodded. "Lieutenant Parker runs the supply detail. Good man. Served under General Thomas, like us. If I vouch for you, he'll help." "And it would be safer than traveling cross-country," Sarah added. "No one would think to look for you on an army supply wagon." Catherine felt a surge of relief at this unexpected solution. "That would be perfect." "Then it's settled," James said. "You'll stay here tonight, and tomorrow I'll take you to meet the wagon." He fixed Elijah with a stern look. "And don't even think of arguing. You saved my life at Antietam. The least I can do is offer you a safe bed for the night and a ride to Fort Ellis." Elijah's shoulders relaxed slightly, some of the tension bleeding from his posture. "Thank you, James. We won't forget this." Sarah rose, collecting empty bowls. "Mary, make up the spare room for Miss Hammond. Ben, bring in more wood for the fire." To Catherine she added, "I'll find you some clean clothes, dear. You're about my size, though perhaps a bit taller." As the family bustled about preparing for their unexpected guests, Catherine felt a curious sense of belonging wash over her. These people strangers just hours ago had welcomed them without hesitation, offered help without question. It was a kindness she hadn't expected, one that touched her deeply. Later, as she settled into the clean, simple bedroom Sarah had prepared for her, Catherine found herself thinking of her own home in Red Creek. The Hammond house was larger, more elegant, than this farmhouse filled with expensive furnishings and the trappings of wealth. Yet it had never felt as warm, as genuinely welcoming as the Wilsons' modest home. Perhaps that was the difference between wealth built on corruption and a life built on honest labor. One created the appearance of prosperity while concealing rot beneath. The other might be humbler, but was solid to its core. As she drifted toward sleep, clean and fed and safe, for the first time in days, Catherine wondered what kind of home she might create for herself when this was all over. Something closer to the Wilsons' farmhouse, she thought, than the cold elegance of the Hammond mansion. Something honest. Something real. Judge Clifford Montgomery stood at the window of his study, watching as the first light of dawn illuminated the streets of Red Creek. Despite the early hour, he was fully dressed in his usual impeccable style black suit, crisp white shirt, gold watch chain draped across his substantial belly. Only the deep circles beneath his eyes and the empty whiskey glass on his desk betrayed his sleepless night. Behind him, Lawrence paced the length of the room, his footsteps muffled by the expensive Persian carpet. "They couldn't have just vanished," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "Morgan's on foot wounded. The Hammond woman isn't used to rough travel. They can't have gone far." Montgomery turned from the window, his expression cold. "Yet your men have failed to find them. Failed rather spectacularly, I might add." Lawrence bristled at the criticism. "We've had riders searching every trail and road between here and Helena. We've sent men to watch the stagecoach stations. We've even paid that half-breed tracker to follow their trail through the forest. And yet," Montgomery said softly, dangerously, "they remain at large, with evidence that could destroy everything we've built." The judge moved to his desk, lowering himself into the leather chair with a sigh that spoke of age and weariness. For a moment, the mask of power slipped, revealing the old man beneath, frightened, desperate, cornered. "Do you understand what will happen if they reach the federal marshal?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything, the bank, the land holdings, your future in politics, all of it gone. And we'll hang Lawrence. They hang men for what we've done." Lawrence stopped pacing, standing straight-backed before his father's desk. "That won't happen. I've doubled the reward for information. $500 now. Someone will talk." "500, Montgomery scoffed. "Make it 1,000. Make it 2. Whatever it takes." He opened a drawer, withdrawing a thin sheaf of papers. "And send these telegrams to our friends in Helena, in Fort Ellis, in every settlement between here and the territorial border. I want eyes everywhere." Lawrence took the papers, scanning their contents. His eyebrows rose. "This will be expensive. Less expensive than a hangman's noose." Montgomery's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the empty whiskey glass. "There's something else. Something I haven't told you." Lawrence looked up sharply. "What? The fire that drew you away from the church ruins. It wasn't an accident." Montgomery's eyes, watery with age and alcohol, met his son's. "I ordered it set. A distraction to give Sheriff Thornton time to search Hammond's house more thoroughly." "And did he find anything?" "Not at the house, but in Hammond's office at the bank, hidden in a secret compartment in his desk." Montgomery withdrew a small leather journal from another drawer, sliding it across the desk. "Walter's private record of our dealings over the years. Every transaction, every bribe, every threat. Names, dates, amounts." Lawrence picked up the journal, flipping through its pages with growing alarm. "Why would he keep this? It implicates him as much as us." Insurance, perhaps, or maybe toward the end he thought it might save his miserable soul if he confessed. Montgomery's lip curled in disgust. Walter always was the weak link. Too much conscience for his own good. Lawrence closed the journal, his expression troubled. If Morgan and the Hammond woman have similar evidence, then we're already hanging by a thread. Montgomery leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Find them, Lawrence. Find them, and end this, whatever it takes. Lawrence nodded, tucking the journal into his coat pocket. I'll send the telegrams immediately, and I'll lead the next search party myself. He paused at the door. What about Martha Taylor? She knows too much. Montgomery waved a dismissive hand. She's an old woman with no proof. Who would believe her word against mine? Besides, she's kept silent for 20 years. Fear is a powerful motivator. And Sheriff Thornton, he seemed hesitant yesterday. Thornton knows where his bread is buttered, Montgomery said confidently. He has too much to lose by turning against us now. After Lawrence left, Montgomery remained at his desk staring at the empty whiskey glass as if it might offer some solution to his predicament. 20 years of careful planning of building power and influence threatened by a long-dead schoolteacher and her inconvenient conscience. He should have killed Martha Taylor, too, all those years ago. Eliminated every loose end. But he'd been younger then, less hardened to the necessities of power. He'd believed that money and fear would buy her silence, and for 20 years he'd been right. Now everything was unraveling threads pulled loose by Walter Hammond's attack of conscience and Catherine Hammond's determination to uncover the truth about her father's death. Montgomery opened the desk drawer again, this time withdrawing a small revolver. He checked that it was loaded, then slipped it into his coat pocket. If Lawrence failed to find Morgan and the Hammond woman, he would have to take matters into his own hands. He was too old, too set in his power to start over elsewhere. Better to ensure that if he fell, he didn't fall alone. Across town, in a small room above the general store, Sheriff Caleb Thornton sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands. His badge lay on the nightstand beside him, the silver star catching the early morning light. Once that badge had represented everything he'd aspired to: respect, authority, a chance to make a difference in a rough frontier town. Now it felt like a brand of shame, a constant reminder of the compromises and corruptions that had gradually eroded his sense of self. Thornton had started small, looking the other way, when Montgomery's business interests required flexibility in the law, accepting bonuses for special attention to the judge's concerns. Over time, the requests had grown larger, the compromises deeper, until Thornton could scarcely remember the idealistic young man who had first pinned on the badge. The search for Morgan and the Hammond woman had forced him to confront the depths to which he had sunk, hunting innocent people to protect a murderer. This was never what he had signed up for. Yet, he had ridden out with Lawrence. Montgomery had given the orders to his deputies, had become part of the conspiracy in ways that could no longer be denied or justified. Thornton picked up the badge, running his thumb over its worn surface. There was a time when he would have been the one people like Catherine Hammond turned to for justice. Now he was just another obstacle in their path, another corrupt official protecting the powerful at the expense of the truth. The weight of it was suddenly, unexpectedly, unbearable. With a decisive motion, Thornton pinned the badge back on his shirt and rose. He had made his decision during the long, sleepless night. It wouldn't undo the damage he had done, wouldn't erase the compromises he had made, but it was a start, a small step toward the man he had once hoped to be. Reaching into his coat pocket, he withdrew a folded piece of paper, the telegram he had written in the pre-dawn hours. Addressed to Federal Marshal James Blackwood in Helena, it contained a brief but comprehensive account of Judge Montgomery's crimes, Sheriff Thornton's own complicity, and the danger now facing Catherine Hammond and Elijah Morgan. Thornton didn't expect forgiveness or leniency. He would likely lose his badge, might even face prison. But for the first time in years, he felt something like peace as he tucked the telegram into his pocket and headed for the door. Some debts could never be fully repaid, but he could at least try to balance the scales a little before the final accounting. Dawn at the Wilson farm found Elijah and Catherine already awake and preparing for their journey. Sarah Wilson had provided Catherine with a practical outfit more suited to travel than her torn and muddy dress, a simple blouse, sturdy skirt, and a warm jacket that had belonged to her oldest daughter, now married and living in Helena. The clothes fit well enough and would attract far less attention than Catherine's bedraggled finery. After a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, James brought around 2 horses, his own sturdy gelding, and a gentle mare for Catherine. "I thought you said the wagon was only 5 miles north," Elijah said, eyeing the horses with mild surprise. "It is," James confirmed. "But the rendezvous point is off the main road and the terrain's rough, easier on horseback." He patted his injured leg. "Even with this old war wound, I'd rather ride than walk those hills." Sarah emerged from the house carrying a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Food for your journey," she explained, handing it to Elijah. "Bread, cheese, dried venison. Should last you to Fort Ellis if you're careful." Catherine was touched by the woman's thoughtfulness. "You've done so much for us already. I don't know how to thank you." Sarah smiled warmly. "No thanks needed, dear. Any decent person would do the same." Her expression grew more serious. "Just promise you'll be careful. Men like Judge Montgomery don't give up power easily." "We will," Catherine assured her, accepting the older woman's brief, fierce hug. Ben and Mary appeared to say their goodbyes as well, the teenager's natural reticence overcome by the excitement of being part of what felt like an adventure from one of the dime novels so popular in the territory. "I put some extra ammunition in your saddlebag, Captain Morgan." Ben said, a hint of hero worship in his eyes. "Pa said you might need it." Elijah nodded his thanks, ruffling the boy's hair with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Good thinking, Ben. A soldier always prepares for all contingencies." The pride that bloomed on the boy's face at this praise was almost comical in its intensity. Catherine found herself smiling despite the seriousness of their situation. These small human moments, a family's kindness, a boy's admiration, a woman's practical compassion, were powerful reminders of what they were fighting to protect. Not abstract concepts like justice or truth, but the very real possibility of a world where good people could live in peace, untroubled by the corruptions of power. They set off as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, James leading the way, Elijah and Catherine following single file on the narrow trail that wound through the hills north of the farm. The day was clear and cool, perfect for traveling with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. "How long have you known the Wilsons?" Catherine asked Elijah as they rode, breaking the companionable silence that had fallen between them. "Met James during the war, as I said," Elijah replied, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings even as they conversed. "Lost track of him after, but ran into him again by chance about 15 years ago when I first came to the territory. Stayed with them for a week while I decided where to settle. They seem like good people." "The best," Elijah agreed, his tone warming with genuine affection. "Salt of the earth, as my father used to say." It was the first time he'd mentioned his family, Catherine realized. Another small piece of the puzzle that was Elijah Morgan. "Were your parents farmers too?" Elijah nodded. "Small place in Ohio. Nothing fancy, but we got by." A shadow crossed his face. "Both gone now. Father in '59, mother during the war." "I'm sorry." Catherine hesitated, then asked, "No siblings? A brother, younger, died at Shiloh. Elijah's tone made it clear the subject was closed, and Catherine respected his unspoken boundary. They rode on, following James along a ridge that offered spectacular views of the valley below. In the distance, the mountains rose majestically against the blue sky, their peaks still capped with winter snow that glinted in the morning sun. It was a breathtaking landscape, a reminder of the vastness and beauty of the territory that had drawn so many settlers west. "I've been thinking," Catherine said after another stretch of silence, "about what happens after. If we succeed, if justice is done." Elijah glanced at her curiosity in his eyes. "And I don't think I can go back to Red Creek," she said slowly, working through her thoughts as she spoke. "Too many memories, too many ghosts. But I don't want to leave the territory either. It's home despite everything." "Helena's a growing city," Elijah suggested. "You could start fresh there." Catherine nodded. "Perhaps. Or maybe somewhere smaller like Miller's Crossing. Open that bookshop I've always dreamed of." She looked at him directly. "What about you? Will you go back to your cabin?" The question seemed to catch Elijah off guard. He was silent for so long that Catherine thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed. "I don't know. For 20 years, that cabin was enough. Now," he shrugged, leaving the thought unfinished. But Catherine understood. Their brief, intense journey together had changed things for both of them, awakened possibilities that had long been dormant, created connections neither had expected to form. "Whatever you decide," she said softly, "you'll always have friends at my bookshop. Even hermits need books occasionally." The smile that briefly illuminated Elijah's weathered face was like sunshine breaking through clouds, unexpected, warming, transformative. It vanished quickly, but Catherine treasured it, filed it away as evidence that beneath the hardened exterior, the man she'd come to respect and care for was still capable of joy. Ahead, James raised his hand, signaling them to stop. They had reached the crest of a hill, and below a narrow road wound through a small valley. James dismounted, motioning for them to do the same. "The supply wagon will pass along that road," he explained, pointing. "According to the schedule, it should be here within the hour. We'll wait just over this ridge out of sight from the road." They secured their horses to a sturdy pine and settled in to wait, finding comfortable spots among the rocks and sparse vegetation. James produced a small telescope from his saddlebag and periodically checked the road in both directions. "How well do you know this Lieutenant Parker?" Elijah asked as they waited. "Well enough," James replied. "Met him at a veterans gathering in Helena last year. He served with General Thomas in Tennessee, same as we did, though in a different regiment. Good reputation." "And you're sure he'll help us?" James lowered the telescope, meeting Elijah's gaze directly. "There's a bond between those of us who served under Thomas. The Rock of Chickamauga expected certain standards from his men: honor, integrity, courage. Parker lives by those standards still." He smiled slightly. "Besides, what soldier can resist a chance to thwart a corrupt judge?" Elijah seemed satisfied with this assessment, though Catherine noticed he checked his rifle and revolver with extra care as they waited, always preparing for the worst, even while hoping for the best. The hour passed slowly. Catherine found herself growing increasingly tense as time stretched on every distant sound, causing her to start. The metal box containing Victoria's evidence seemed to burn against her skin, where she carried it, a constant reminder of the stakes of their journey. "There," James said, suddenly raising the telescope again. "Wagon coming from the east. 2 men on the box, army uniforms. That'll be Parker." Relief washed over Catherine, Soon they would be on their way to Fort Ellis, to safety, to justice. James stood making his way carefully down the slope toward the road. "Wait here until I signal it's safe," he instructed over his shoulder. Catherine and Elijah watched as James emerged onto the road just as the wagon approached. He waved his arms, and the wagon slowed, then stopped. From their vantage point, they could see James speaking earnestly to the soldiers, occasionally gesturing back toward the ridge where they waited. "Something's wrong," Elijah murmured, his body tensing beside Catherine. "What do you mean?" she asked, straining to see what had alarmed him. "James is talking too long. And look at the soldiers, they keep glancing at each other. They're nervous." Now that he pointed it out, Catherine could see it too, a tension in the tableau below that hadn't been there moments before. James's gestures had become more emphatic, almost pleading, while the soldiers maintained a wary distance, one hand never far from their sidearms. "Get back to the horses," Elijah said quietly, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Now." Catherine didn't question the order hearing in his tone, the same soldier who had led men in battle, who had survived the bloodiest conflicts of the war through instinct and quick thinking. She retreated up the slope, Elijah close behind both of them, moving in a half-crouch to stay below the ridge line. They had just reached the horses when they heard it, the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching fast from the west. "Ambush," Elijah breathed, his face grim. "Someone got to Parker before we did." Horror washed over Catherine as understanding dawned. "James, he's down there exposed." Elijah was already swinging into his saddle. "Get on your horse. We're leaving." "But James can take care of himself." Elijah cut her off, though the conflict in his eyes belied the harshness of his words. "The evidence is what matters now. We can't let it fall into Montgomery's hands." Catherine knew he was right, but the thought of abandoning the man who had risked so much to help them was physically painful. Still, she mounted her horse, understanding with bitter clarity that their options had narrowed to a single-path flight. They set off eastward, skirting the ridge to stay out of sight of the road below. Behind them, shouts erupted, followed by the crack of a single gunshot. Catherine flinched at the sound, her imagination painting terrible pictures of what might be happening to James Wilson. "Keep going," Elijah urged, his voice tight with the same concern that gripped her. "There's nothing we can do for him now." They rode hard for nearly an hour, following game trails and dry creek beds, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the ambush site. Catherine's mind raced with questions. How had Montgomery's men known about the supply wagon? Had they been betrayed? Was James alive or dead? And most pressingly, where could they go now? Eventually, they slowed their pace to rest the horses, finding a small clearing beside a stream where the animals could drink. Catherine dismounted stiffly, her muscles protesting the unaccustomed exertion. Elijah did the same, moving with the fluid grace of a man far more comfortable on horseback than she. "Fort Ellis is out of the question now," Elijah said, breaking the tense silence that had fallen between them. "They'll be watching all approaches." "So is Helena," Catherine added. "Where does that leave us?" Elijah studied the surrounding landscape, his expression thoughtful. "West," he decided. "Through the mountains to Virginia City. It's a longer journey, harder terrain, but Montgomery's influence doesn't reach as far there. We could find a federal official, or at least someone honest enough to get a telegram through to Helena." Catherine nodded, accepting his judgment. "How long?" 4 days, maybe 5. Depends on the weather and whether we're followed." Elijah checked their supplies, mentally calculating. "We have food for 3 days if we're careful, can hunt for the rest." The plan was sensible, their best option under the circumstances. Yet Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded, forced to react to Montgomery's moves rather than setting their own course. It was an uncomfortable sensation for a woman accustomed to control, to careful planning and predictable outcomes. "I keep thinking about James," she admitted, her voice small. "If something happened to him because of us—" Elijah's expression softened. "James knew the risks, and he's survived worse odds." He hesitated, then added, "But I understand. The weight of it doesn't get lighter." The simple acknowledgement of her guilt, the recognition that he shared it, provided more comfort than any false reassurances could have. Catherine felt a rush of gratitude for this man who had become in the space of a few days the person who best understood her. "We should keep moving," she said, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Virginia City awaits." Elijah nodded, a flicker of something like pride in his eyes. "We'll rest the horses a bit longer, then head out. We can cover another 10 miles before nightfall." As they prepared to leave, Catherine found herself looking eastward toward the distant ridge where they had left James Wilson. She offered a silent prayer for his safety, a promise to repay his kindness someday, if fate allowed it. Then she turned her gaze westward toward the mountains that now represented their best hope for justice. One step at a time, 1 mile at a time, they would make it. They had to. The mountain pass loomed before them, a narrow gap between towering peaks that seemed to touch the very clouds. It was the morning of their 3rd day of travel westward, and the terrain had grown increasingly difficult. Steep slopes, dense forests, rushing streams that had to be forded with care. Their progress had been slower than Elijah had hoped, the horses struggling on the rough mountain trails. Despite these challenges, they had seen no sign of pursuit since leaving the Wilson farm. Whether this was good fortune or cause for concern, neither could say with certainty. "The pass is our best route through to the western valleys," Elijah explained as they paused to rest the horses. "Once we're through, it's an easier journey to Virginia City." Catherine studied the imposing landscape ahead. "How long to cross it?" "Most of the day, if the weather holds." Elijah glanced at the sky, where clouds were beginning to gather above the peaks. "We should move quickly. Mountain storms can be sudden and dangerous this time of year." They set off again, the trail narrowing as they began the ascent into the pass. The air grew cooler as they climbed, the vegetation changing from the mixed forests of the lower elevations to hardy pines and scrub brush that clung tenaciously to the rocky soil. The views were spectacular, rolling hills and valleys spread out below them, the land stretching away to the horizon in a patchwork of greens and browns. Under different circumstances, Catherine might have found the journey exhilarating. As it was, she appreciated the beauty around them, with a distracted part of her mind, the greater part remaining vigilant for any sign of danger. They had been climbing for perhaps 2 hours when Elijah suddenly reined in his horse, raising a hand for Catherine to do the same. He sat motionless, head slightly tilted, listening intently. "What is it?" Catherine whispered, her hand moving instinctively to the pocket where she carried her derringer. Elijah shook his head slightly, still listening. After a moment, he relaxed marginally. "Thought I heard something. Probably just an animal." They continued on, but Catherine noticed that Elijah kept one hand near his revolver as they rode, his gaze constantly scanning the trail ahead and the slopes to either side. His caution was infectious, and she found herself listening more carefully, watching more intently, as if danger might materialize at any moment from the rocks and trees around them. The trail grew steeper, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses for stretches where the footing was particularly treacherous. The clouds had continued to gather, and a chill wind now blew down from the mountain peaks, carrying the promise of rain. The weather seemed to mirror their circumstances, growing more threatening with each passing hour, the storm drawing closer just as they approached the most exposed part of their journey. They had reached a point where the trail curved around a massive boulder, opening onto a relatively flat expanse before the final climb to the pass itself. Elijah went first, leading his horse around the bend. Catherine followed a few steps behind her mind on the challenging terrain ahead. The sound of a rifle being cocked stopped her cold. "That's far enough," came a familiar voice from behind the boulder. Lawrence Montgomery stepped into view, rifle aimed steadily at Elijah's chest. Behind him emerged Sheriff Thornton, looking haggard and uncomfortable, his hand resting uneasily on his holstered revolver. And beside them, to Catherine's shock and horror, stood James Wilson, his expression a mask of shame and regret. "James!" Elijah breathed disbelief evident in his voice. "What have you done?" "I'm sorry, Elijah," James replied, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "They had Sarah and the children. I had no choice." Understanding dawned in Elijah's eyes, followed quickly by a cold fury that transformed his face into something almost unrecognizable. "You used his family as leverage," he said to Montgomery, the words precise and cutting. "Threatened them to force his cooperation." Montgomery's smile was without warmth or humor. "Quite effectively, as you can see. Mr. Wilson has been most helpful in tracking you through these mountains." He gestured with the rifle. "Now, Miss Hammond, if you would be so kind as to hand over the evidence you stole from the church ruins." Catherine made no move to comply, her mind racing to find some way out of their predicament. Elijah stood between her and Montgomery, his body tense but controlled like a coiled spring waiting for the moment to release. "There's no way out of this, Miss Hammond," Montgomery continued, his tone almost conversational. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Give me what I want, and perhaps we can come to an arrangement that leaves you both alive." "Like the arrangement you made with my father," Catherine retorted, anger overcoming fear. "Before you had him killed." A flash of irritation crossed Montgomery's face. "Your father became a liability. He was going to expose everything we'd built, throw away 20 years of work, because his conscience suddenly developed teeth." His lip curled in contempt. "Weak, just like your grandmother." The casual cruelty of the words, the dismissal of two lives as mere inconveniences, ignited something in Catherine, a rage so pure and clarifying that it burned away all hesitation, all uncertainty. "Victoria Winfield was worth 100 of you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion churning within her. "She stood for truth when it was easier to look away. She chose right over easy. That's not weakness, Montgomery. That's the kind of strength you've never understood." The judge's expression hardened. "Enough philosophy, Miss Hammond. The evidence. Now." Catherine straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "No." The single word hung in the air between them, simple but absolute in its defiance. Montgomery's eyes narrowed, and he shifted the rifle slightly, aiming it more directly at Elijah's heart. "Perhaps I haven't made myself clear. Give me what I want, or I will kill Morgan where he stands. Then I will kill you. And finally, I will return to Red Creek and ensure that everyone who helped you, Martha Taylor, the Wilson family, meets with unfortunate accidents." His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "I've built my empire on bodies before, Miss Hammond. A few more won't trouble my sleep." Catherine felt the weight of the metal box against her skin, felt the lives balanced against it. Elijah's, her own, the innocent Wilson's. Was justice for Victoria worth such a price? Worth more blood, more loss? Before she could decide, Thornton spoke up, his voice strained. "This has gone far enough, Montgomery. I didn't sign up for threatening families and murdering women." Montgomery didn't take his eyes off Catherine and Elijah. You signed up for exactly what I tell you. You signed up for sheriff. Remember your place. My place is upholding the law, Thornton replied, a new steadiness in his tone, something I've forgotten for too long. With deliberate movements, he unbuckled his gun belt, letting it fall to the ground. I sent a telegram to Federal Marshal Blackwood in Helena 3 days ago. Full confession of everything: Victoria Winfield's murder, the embezzlement, Walter Hammond's death. My own part in all of it. Montgomery's head snapped around, shock and fury, battling for dominance in his expression. You did what? The right thing for once, Thornton said simply. The moment of distraction was all Elijah needed. With the fluid speed of a man well-practiced in violence, he drew his revolver, firing in one continuous motion. The bullet struck Montgomery's shoulder, spinning him backward, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air. In the chaos that followed, several things happened almost simultaneously. Thornton dove for his discarded gun belt. James Wilson tackled Montgomery as he attempted to rise, wrestling him to the ground despite his wounded leg. And Catherine, acting on instinct, pulled her derringer and aimed it at Montgomery's head. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady, "or I swear by Victoria's grave I'll finish what Elijah started." Montgomery froze, recognizing the deadly intent in her eyes. Blood seeped through his fine coat where Elijah's bullet had struck, but the wound didn't appear life-threatening, a fact that Catherine found both disappointing and just. Death would be too quick, too easy for a man who had caused so much suffering. Thornton had retrieved his revolver and now stood somewhat uncertainly beside James. "I'll take him into custody," he said. "See that he faces proper justice." Elijah looked to Catherine, deferring to her decision. It was her family that had been destroyed by this man, her justice to claim. She had the power in this moment to end Montgomery's life with a single squeeze of the trigger, to avenge Victoria Walter and all the others who had suffered at his hands. It would be so easy, so final, so wrong. "No," Catherine said, finally lowering the derringer. "He doesn't get to die by my hand. He faces a court, a jury, the law he's perverted for so long." She met Montgomery's gaze directly. "He lives with his shame, with everyone knowing exactly what kind of monster wears that judge's robes." Relief flickered across Thornton's face. "That's the right call, Miss Hammond." They secured Montgomery with rope from one of the saddlebags, binding his wounded shoulder as best they could to prevent blood loss. Throughout the process, the judge maintained a stony silence, his eyes burning with hatred, and something else, fear perhaps, or the dawning realization that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him. "What happens now?" James asked, looking to Elijah and Catherine. "My family are safe," Thornton assured him. "I sent deputies I trust to watch over them before I left. Montgomery was bluffing. He had no men at your farm." The relief that washed over James's face was painful to witness. "Thank God," he breathed. "I'm sorry, Elijah. Catherine, You thought your family was in danger," Elijah finished for him. "I would have done the same." With Montgomery secured on James's horse, they began the journey back down the mountain. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke as they reached the lower slopes, rain falling in heavy sheets that seemed to wash away more than just the dust of the trail. Catherine felt a curious lightness, as if a burden she had carried for days, perhaps even longer, without knowing it had been lifted from her shoulders. They made camp that night in a small cave at the base of the mountains. The captured judge kept under close watch by Thornton and James, while Elijah and Catherine gathered firewood and prepared a simple meal from their dwindling supplies. "It's really over, isn't it?" Catherine said softly, as they sat by the fire, the rain creating a curtain of water across the cave entrance. Victoria will finally have justice. Elijah nodded, his face solemn in the firelight. Justice, yes, but not restoration. That's the hard truth about these things. We can punish the guilty, but we can't bring back what was lost. No, Catherine agreed. But we can honor it, remember it, build something better from its ashes. She looked across the cave to where Montgomery sat, bound and defeated. And we can ensure that men like him don't get to shape the world anymore. Elijah's expression softened, something like admiration warming his eyes. You're a remarkable woman, Catherine Hammond. Victoria would be proud. The simple words, spoken with such quiet certainty, meant more to Catherine than any elaborate praise could have. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. They fell silent, watching the flames dance before them, each lost in private thoughts, as the rain continued its steady drumming outside. Tomorrow they would return to civilization, to the complexities of legal proceedings and public revelations. But tonight, in this moment of peace, hard-won, they could simply be two people who had faced darkness together and emerged, changed but unbroken, into the light.